They called it the American Dream, a promise of hope and opportunity. But behind that promise, millions suffered. This video explores how the dream was sold as hope, but built on suffering.
Long before it was printed on posters or debated in classrooms, the American dream existed as a feeling. It was not written down, not clearly explained, and not agreed upon. It arrived as a whisper carried across oceans, folded into letters, sermons, rumors, and newspaper headlines. People heard it differently depending on where they stood. To some, it meant land. To others, gold. To many, it meant escape from hunger, from hierarchy, from names that carried weight and limits. The dream did not begin as a plan. It began as a promise, spoken loosely and believed deeply, long before anyone stopped to ask what it truly required or who it was meant for. In the 19th century, the promise grew louder. America presented itself not as a finished nation, but as an open sentence. Maps showed vast spaces marked with little more than rivers and vague borders. The emptiness was persuasive. It suggested possibility without consequence. The dream was not sold as certainty. It was sold as potential. If you were willing to leave, to endure, to risk everything familiar, the future might reward you. That might was rarely emphasized. Hope did not need guarantees. It only needed contrast, and the old world provided plenty. Rigid class systems, inherited poverty, unmovable social ranks. Compared to that, uncertainty felt generous. People came carrying definitions of the dream they had invented themselves. Farmers imagined acres that belonged only to them. Laborers imagined wages that could grow into ownership. Immigrants imagined anonymity, the freedom to become someone without a past. The dream adapted to the dreamer. That flexibility was its greatest strength and its greatest deception. Because the dream was never defined, it could never be disproven. When success failed to arrive, the explanation was simple. You had misunderstood it, misapplied it, or not worked hard enough. No single authority ever explained the terms. There was no handbook outlining the costs. There was no clause describing who would be excluded. Instead, the dream spread through stories of exceptional outcomes. One man found gold. One family built a farm from nothing. One immigrant rose to prominence. These stories were repeated until they felt representative. What was left unsaid mattered more than what was celebrated. For every success, thousands struggled quietly, their lives blending into the background noise of progress. Their stories lacked spectacle, so they were rarely told. The dream promised mobility but relied on stability it never provided. People uprooted themselves, believing movement itself was opportunity. Wagons rolled west filled with furniture, tools, children, and expectation. Ships crossed oceans crowded with bodies pressed together by hope and fear. The dream required sacrifice immediately, but deferred reward indefinitely. It asked for patience without offering timelines. For many, waiting became a way of life. Years passed, measured not by achievement, but by endurance. The language of the dream was moral as much as economic. Hard work was framed not just as a necessity, but as virtue. Success was evidence of character. Failure, by contrast, became a personal flaw. This moral framing was crucial. It shifted responsibility away from systems and placed it squarely on individuals. If the dream did not materialize, the explanation was internal, not structural. People learned to blame themselves even when the conditions were stacked against them. The dream remained innocent. The dreamer absorbed the guilt. This undefined promise allowed inequality to coexist with optimism. Opportunity was spoken of as universal, even when access clearly was not. Laws, customs, and violence shaped who could participate fully. Land ownership, credit, legal protection, and safety were unevenly distributed. Yet, the dream's language smoothed these differences over. It spoke in abstractions, anyone, everyone, possibility.
The specifics were left to reality, which enforced its own rules quietly and relentlessly. The dream also thrived because it was future-oriented. It encouraged people to endure present hardship for imagined reward. Hunger was temporary, loneliness was temporary, exploitation was temporary. The future would compensate. This logic kept people compliant. It discouraged resistance. To complain too loudly was to admit doubt, and doubt felt like betrayal, not just of the dream, but of oneself. Faith in the promise became a form of survival. Communities formed around shared belief even when shared success never arrived. Mining camps, farming settlements, factory towns, all organized around the expectation that effort would eventually pay off. When it didn't, people adapted by narrowing their hopes rather than questioning the promise. A smaller house, a safer job, a chance for the children. The dream shrank quietly, becoming more modest with each generation, even as its rhetoric remained grand. The lack of definition allowed the dream to evolve without accountability. When land became scarce, the dream shifted toward wages. When wages stagnated, it shifted toward education. When education failed to guarantee security, it shifted toward personal branding and hustle. Each iteration preserved the core idea that success was available to those who deserved it. The criteria for deservingness changed, but the moral structure remained intact. What the dream never acknowledged was the role of timing. Being born at the right moment mattered as much as effort. Those who arrived early found abundance. Those who came later found competition. The dream did not reset for latecomers. It did not account for depletion of land, of resources, of opportunity. Yet it continued to speak as if the frontier were eternal, as if space and possibility were infinite. Scarcity was experienced individually, never admitted collectively. The dream also depended on forgetting those who failed, forgetting those who were excluded, forgetting the violence that cleared land and forced labor and protected property. Memory complicated the promise. Amnesia sustained it. History books focused on builders and winners because their stories were easier to frame as progress. Suffering was treated as transitional, not foundational. The dream stood on omissions as much as on achievements. Children inherited the promise without context. They were taught that opportunity awaited them if they prepared correctly. Education became both gateway and filter. Those who succeeded were proof the dream worked. Those who didn't were cautionary tales. Structural barriers were rarely named. The dream persisted not because it was universally experienced, but because it was endlessly taught. Over time, the dream became inseparable from identity. To question it felt unpatriotic. Critique was framed as cynicism. Gratitude was expected, even from those who struggled. The dream's power lay not in its accuracy, but in its emotional grip. It offered meaning in uncertainty. It suggested that suffering was not random, but purposeful. That belief mattered deeply to people navigating unstable lives. Yet cracks appeared. Economic downturns, wars, and social movements exposed the fragility of the promise. People began to notice patterns: who consistently succeeded, who consistently struggled, and who paid the price when systems failed. The dream did not collapse, it adjusted. It absorbed critique by reframing itself again, insisting it had merely been misunderstood. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. The dream was never a contract. It was an invitation without guarantees. It offered direction, not destination. Those who benefited most from it often mistook their fortune for proof of fairness. Those who didn't were left navigating disappointment that felt deeply personal, even when it was widely shared. A dream promised before it was defined cannot be held accountable. That was its design. It inspired movement, labor, and loyalty without committing to outcomes. It asked people to believe first and understand later.
By the time understanding arrived, investment was already too deep to abandon easily. The American dream did not fail everyone, but it never intended to include everyone equally. Its power came from ambiguity, its endurance came from hope, and its cost was paid quietly by those who believed most deeply, worked most faithfully, and waited longest for a definition that never fully arrived. In the end, the dream's greatest achievement was not wealth or expansion, but belief itself. The belief that effort alone could conquer circumstance, that promise equaled possibility, and that the future owed something to those who endured the present. It was a beautiful idea. It was also an incomplete one. And in that incompleteness, countless lives unfolded, some triumphant, many unseen, beneath a promise that had never been clearly, honestly defined.
From a distance, the land looked endless. Horizons stretched so wide they seemed to erase boundaries entirely. Rivers ran for days without interruption. Plains rolled outward like oceans of grass, and mountains stood as silent witnesses to centuries no map could fully capture. To those arriving from crowded cities, rigid social systems, and exhausted soil, the land felt like freedom made visible. It suggested that space itself was opportunity, that ownership was only a matter of arrival, that the future had room for anyone willing to step into it. But the land was only half the promise. The other half, the part rarely spoken aloud, came with conditions. In the 19th century, the idea of limitless land fueled movement on a scale few societies had ever experienced. Newspapers described vast territories waiting to be claimed. Government policies encouraged settlement, offering parcels of land to those willing to work them. Letters sent home exaggerated abundance and minimized hardship. The message was consistent. There was room for everyone. What was less visible were the invisible rules that governed who could truly benefit, who could claim security, and who would always remain temporary guests on land that appeared open but was never neutral. The land itself did not discriminate. It did not ask names, origins, or intentions. It offered soil, water, timber, and stone to anyone who could endure its demands. But access to permanence, legal ownership, protection, and profit was tightly controlled. Opportunity did not flow evenly across the open terrain. It followed lines of law, race, capital, and power. The land appeared infinite. The pathways through it were narrow. For settlers arriving with resources, the land functioned as advertised. A deed provided legitimacy. A fence transformed space into property. Time invested translated into equity. For others, the same land functioned very differently. It became a place of labor rather than ownership, extraction rather than stability. People could work it, move through it, and even depend on it for survival, yet never truly belong to it in any recognized sense. The contradiction was subtle but powerful. The land symbolized freedom, while opportunity required permission. Many who arrived believed effort alone would unlock success. They measured progress in hours worked, miles traveled, and hardships endured. The land rewarded persistence unevenly. Droughts erased seasons of labor. Floods reclaimed fields without apology. Markets shifted beyond the control of those who planted and harvested. Survival demanded more than determination. It demanded adaptability, timing, and often luck. Yet the narrative surrounding the land insisted that success was moral, that those who prospered deserved it, and those who failed simply had not tried hard enough. This belief masked the conditions embedded in opportunity. Access to credit determined whether a bad year ended in recovery or ruin. Legal recognition determined whose claims would be defended and whose would be dismissed. Proximity to markets determined whether abundance translated into income or waste. These factors were rarely framed as barriers. They were treated as natural outcomes,
reinforcing the illusion that the land itself sorted winners from losers. For indigenous peoples, the notion of land without limits was a profound distortion. The land had always been defined, not by fences, but by relationships, stewardship, and memory. When settlers arrived, they did not enter empty space, they entered living systems. Yet treaties reduced those systems to boundaries that could be redrawn. Promises were made, revised, and broken. The land was declared open while the original inhabitants were confined. Opportunity expanded for newcomers while collapsing for those who had always been there. The conditions were enforced through law and violence, often presented as inevitability. Expansion required displacement. Progress required sacrifice, but never evenly distributed sacrifice. Indigenous communities bore the cost of a dream that was never offered to them. The land remained beneath their feet, but access to it shifted beyond their control. For immigrants, the land represented escape as much as opportunity. Many arrived seeking anonymity, hoping distance would loosen the grip of class, debt, or persecution. Some succeeded, carving out spaces of relative stability. Others discovered that arrival did not equal acceptance. The land welcomed labor more readily than people. Fields, railways, mines, and towns absorbed bodies while withholding belonging. Opportunity existed, but only within prescribed roles. Advancement beyond those roles triggered resistance. The promise of land ownership functioned as both motivation and gatekeeper. It encouraged loyalty to systems that excluded many from full participation. People labored for years, believing permanence lay just beyond the next season, the next harvest, the next contract. When ownership remained elusive, blame turned inward. The land stayed blameless. The system remained unquestioned. Women experienced the land through a different set of conditions. They were essential to survival, growing food, managing households, educating children, sustaining communities, yet rarely granted authority or recognition. The land offered work, but not autonomy. Legal structures limited ownership, inheritance, and independence. Even when women held land, their claims were often mediated through men. Opportunity existed, but it was conditional on gendered expectations that confined ambition.
Children inherited both the promise and its constraints. They learned early that survival required contribution. Education competed with labor. Stability depended on adult endurance. The land shaped childhood unevenly, granting security to some and precarity to others. The dream of limitless opportunity rarely accounted for the cost of growing up within its boundaries. As settlements expanded, the environmental cost of exploitation became harder to ignore. Forests fell, rivers shifted course, soil depleted. The land absorbed ambition, but recorded its consequences quietly. Those with means adapted, moving on, investing elsewhere. Those without remained amid damage, their opportunities shrinking alongside the landscape's capacity to recover. The land that once symbolized freedom began to impose its own limits. Still, the language of abundance persisted. It evolved rather than disappeared. When land ran out, opportunity was reframed as mobility. When mobility failed, it became innovation. When innovation faltered, it became resilience. Each shift preserved the idea that success was available, while redefining the conditions required to reach it. The dream adjusted, inequality endured. The land's openness also functioned as distraction. It suggested that struggle was temporary, that space always remained to move forward. This belief delayed confrontation with systemic barriers. People kept moving rather than organizing, adapting rather than resisting. The land absorbed discontent by offering the illusion of another chance just over the horizon.
Over time, the myth of limitless land became cultural identity. It shaped how societies understood fairness, effort, and entitlement. Those who benefited most from the system mistook access for merit. Those excluded internalized failure. The conditions governing opportunity faded into background assumptions, rarely named, rarely challenged. Yet the evidence accumulated. Patterns repeated across generations. Wealth concentrated. Mobility slowed. The land no longer expanded, but the promise continued as if it did. The contradiction grew harder to ignore. Opportunity was praised as universal, while experienced as selective. The land had limits after all, geographic, environmental, and moral. Understanding this does not erase the courage of those who crossed distances, endured hardship, and built lives from uncertainty. Their resilience was real. Their labor mattered. But acknowledging resilience does not require ignoring restriction. The land offered possibility, but it did not offer fairness. Opportunity existed, but it demanded compliance with conditions shaped by power. The true legacy of expansion lies not only in cities built or borders drawn, but in the tension between promise and reality. The land without limits invited belief. Opportunity with conditions determined outcomes. Together, they created a system that inspired movement while constraining arrival. Today, the language remains familiar. Opportunity is still described as open. Effort is still praised as sufficient. The land may no longer stretch endlessly westward, but the myth persists in new forms, careers, markets, identities. The conditions have changed, but they have not disappeared. To see the land honestly is to see both its generosity and its demands. It offers space, but not equality. It provides resources, but not justice. It invites participation, but controls reward. Recognizing this does not diminish the dream. It clarifies it. It transforms myth into understanding. Land without limits was never the whole story. Opportunity always came with conditions, written into law, enforced by custom, and reinforced by silence. The future belongs to those who deny this truth, but to those willing to confront it, name it, and imagine a version of opportunity that does not depend on exclusion to function. Only then can the promise evolve from illusion into intention, and the land become not just open, but fair.
Every great movement begins before it has proof, before maps are accurate, before success is visible, before stories are confirmed. It begins with belief. Not belief in certainty, but belief in possibility. The first believers are never the beneficiaries of comfort. They're the ones who move when evidence is thin and risk is overwhelming. They step forward when the promise exists only as rumor, as imagination, as an idea powerful enough to outweigh fear. In the story of westward expansion, they were the ones who left first, leaving homes, families, familiarity, and security behind for something that did not yet exist in any reliable form. They did not leave because life was easy. They left because it was constrained. Farms were subdivided until soil could no longer sustain families. Cities grew crowded, wages shrank, and opportunity hardened into hierarchy. For many, the future felt predetermined, inherited rather than earned. The idea of the West, vast, open, undefined, offered something radically different. It suggested that identity itself could be rebuilt, that effort might finally align with reward, that a person could step beyond their past rather than remain entrapped inside it. The first believers did not share a single background. They came from farms and factories, ports and villages, from places where land was scarce and status fixed. Some were deeply religious,
interpreting opportunity as divine invitation. Others were pragmatic, calculating risk with the cold precision of necessity. Many were desperate. What united them was not ideology, but willingness, the willingness to abandon certainty for possibility. Leaving was not dramatic at first. It happened quietly, in small decisions made over kitchen tables and in crowded boarding houses. Belongings were sold or abandoned. Tools were chosen carefully. Letters were written with restrained optimism, often concealing doubt. Goodbyes were brief, not because separation was painless, but because acknowledging its permanence made departure unbearable. Many believed they would return. Few understood how thoroughly departure would change them. The journey itself reshaped belief. Distance introduced reality. Roads dissolved into trails. Trails vanished into wilderness. Wagons broke. Animals failed. Weather ignored preparation. Hunger tested resolve. Each mile demanded confirmation that the decision had been right. Yet turning back required admitting error, not just to others, but to oneself. For many, belief hardened into stubbornness. They continued not because conditions improved, but because retreat felt worse than endurance. The first believers learned quickly that the land did not care about intention. It rewarded no one for courage alone. Rivers flooded regardless of hope. Mountains resisted passage without apology. Seasons arrived early or late, indifferent to planning. Those who survived learned humility. They adapted. They adjusted expectations. They redefined success from triumph to survival. The belief that had carried them forward transformed from optimism into endurance. Not all belief was rewarded equally. Some arrived early enough to claim fertile land, access emerging markets, or establish businesses before competition intensified. For them, belief became legacy. Their risks were later framed as vision. Their sacrifices became origin stories. Others arrived only slightly later and encountered closed doors instead of open land. Prices had risen, claims were contested, laws had changed. Belief did not expire, but opportunity narrowed. Failure was common, though rarely documented. Many returned home poorer than when they left, carrying stories they struggled to explain. Others settled temporarily, then moved on again, chasing the promise from place to place as conditions shifted. Some never returned at all, not because they succeeded, but because they could not afford to leave. The West absorbed people unevenly, granting permanence to some and impermanence to others. Families bore belief differently. Men often departed first, promising to send for wives and children once stability was secured. Months became years. Letters grew infrequent. Some families reunited. Others dissolved quietly, without closure. Women who traveled faced layered challenges: labor without recognition, vulnerability without protection, responsibility without authority. Their belief was rarely celebrated, yet it sustained households, communities, and survival itself. Children inherited belief without choice. They grew up on roads, in camps, on unstable ground. Education was intermittent. Labor was constant. For some, the West offered space to grow beyond inherited class. For others, it imposed hardship before childhood had fully ended. Their belief was not ideological. It was learned through necessity. They adapted because adaptation was the only option.
The first believers also encountered those who had never left, the people already living on the land. Indigenous nations observed the arrival of newcomers who believed they were discovering something new. The believers saw opportunity. Indigenous communities sought disruption. Agreements were made and broken. Boundaries shifted. Belief became justification. Expansion reframed displacement as destiny. The cost of belief was not shared equally. Over time, belief evolved into structure. Governments formalized settlement. Railroads replaced trails. Markets stabilized. Towns emerged. The risks that defined the first believers diminished for those who followed. Their hardship became mythology, simplified into stories of grit and determination. What was lost were the contradictions, the failures, exclusions, and sacrifices that did not produce visible reward. The first believers were not heroes in the way history prefers. They were uncertain, flawed, and often wrong. They misjudged distances, climates, and systems. They underestimated resistance and overestimated fairness. Yet without them, expansion would not have occurred at the pace it did. Their belief moved borders, economies, and narratives forward, even when it consumed them in the process. Some succeeded spectacularly, others merely survived. Many vanished into anonymity, their belief leaving no monument behind. Their names were not recorded, their labor blended into landscapes reshaped by others. Success favored those whose belief aligned with timing, access, and protection. The rest became footnotes or were omitted entirely. What distinguishes the first believers is not outcome, but willingness. They accepted risk without guarantee. They stepped forward without proof. They invested lives in ideas that had not yet been tested. Their belief was not always noble, but it was powerful. It fueled movement before systems existed to support it. Today, belief is marketed differently. Opportunity appears packaged, regulated, and predictable. Yet the same dynamic persists. Those who move first still bear the greatest risk. Those who follow benefit from structure built by others. The difference is visibility. The first believers of the past were easier to mythologize. Their suffering could be romanticized once its consequences were absorbed. To understand them honestly is not to glorify or condemn. It is to recognize belief as a force that reshapes lives unevenly. It creates pathways and casualties simultaneously. It opens futures while closing others. The first believers did not know this. They believed movement itself was enough. They left everything behind not because they were reckless, but because staying felt impossible. Their belief was less about conquest and more about escape, from stagnation, from limitation, from inherited constraint. That belief carried them farther than logic ever could. In the end, the legacy of the first believers is not measured by land claimed or wealth accumulated. It is measured by transformation. They changed themselves, often permanently. They altered the trajectory of nations without ever controlling the outcome. They proved that belief can move people before it moves systems, and that the cost of belief is always paid up front. They were the first to step into uncertainty. Others followed into structure. History remembers the destination, it forgets the leap. And yet, every leap forward begins the same way, with someone willing to leave everything behind, believing that the unknown holds more promise than the familiar ever could.
No one ever admitted the rule book existed. That was the first rule. It was never printed, never signed, never officially acknowledged. Yet everyone felt its weight. It shaped outcomes, decided futures, and separated those who would rise from those who would remain standing just below the threshold, wondering what they had missed. The silent rulebook governed success without explanation, and the cruelest part was not its power, but its invisibility. From the outside, the system appeared fair. Opportunity was advertised loudly. Posters spoke of freedom, equality, and endless possibility. Schools taught that effort led to reward. Employers claimed merit was the only currency that mattered. Politicians repeated the language of open doors and level playing fields, and for a time, many believed it. They believed because they wanted to, because belief was easier than suspicion, because questioning the rules meant admitting that the game might be unwinnable for reasons no one was willing to explain.
The rulebook revealed itself slowly, in moments that felt personal rather than structural. A promotion passed to someone less qualified but better connected. A loan denied without a clear reason. A neighborhood that looked welcoming until an unspoken boundary was crossed. These moments were easy to dismiss in isolation. Bad luck, people said. Timing, personality, anything but a pattern. The rulebook depended on this denial. It thrived in fragments, never fully visible unless someone dared to connect the dots. Those born into the system learned the rules early, though no one named them as such. They absorbed them through tone and silence, through observation rather than instruction. They learned which schools mattered and which merely existed, which accents sounded trustworthy, which mistakes were forgivable, and which were permanent. The rulebook was passed down not as a document, but as instinct. It lived in dinner conversations, casual advice, and warnings disguised as concern. For outsiders, the learning curve was brutal. They followed the official instructions carefully. They worked harder, studied longer, complied more thoroughly. When success failed to arrive, they blamed themselves. The rulebook had taught them that failure was individual, never systemic. If you didn't advance, you simply hadn't tried hard enough, or so the story went. This belief was perhaps the rulebook's greatest triumph. It turned structural exclusion into personal shame. Immigrants felt the rulebook sharply, though rarely immediately. At first, everything seemed possible. The language of opportunity sounded sincere. But over time, invisible ceilings emerged. Credentials lost value at the border. Experience needed translation that never fully convinced. Names became obstacles. The rulebook did not forbid success outright. It simply demanded more proof, more patience, more conformity. Some adapted. Others exhausted themselves trying. Race, class, and geography each had their own chapters in the rulebook. None were written, yet all were enforced. Certain neighborhoods promised safety and stability. Others were treated as warnings. Schools in one district opened doors effortlessly, while others required extraordinary achievement just to be noticed. The rulebook never said this was intentional. It didn't need to. Its power came from consistency, not confession. Workplaces were among its most efficient enforcers. Hiring criteria sounded neutral, yet favored familiarity. Culture fit became a polite euphemism for resemblance. Advancement depended not only on performance, but on proximity to power. Mentorship flowed unevenly. Mistakes by some were framed as learning experiences. Mistakes by others became defining flaws. The rulebook did not punish ambition. It punished ambition from the wrong direction.
Those who succeeded often insisted the rulebook was a myth, a comforting illusion invented by those unwilling to take responsibility. After all, they had followed the same visible rules and succeeded. What they failed to see was the invisible assistance, the safety nets, second chances, and quiet endorsements that smoothed their path. To acknowledge the rulebook would mean questioning the purity of their achievement. Many preferred certainty to complexity. Education reinforced the silence. History lessons emphasized progress without detailing resistance. Inequality was discussed as a past problem already resolved by law, if not by practice. Students learned to celebrate opportunity without examining access. The rulebook remained unassigned reading, present everywhere, required nowhere. Those who sensed its presence were often labeled cynical or ungrateful. The rulebook also shaped aspiration. Some dreams were encouraged, others subtly discouraged. Creative ambition was celebrated in theory, but punished in practice unless paired with financial security. Risk was admirable when failure had a cushion. Entrepreneurship was heroic when backed by capital. The rulebook did not eliminate dreams, it filtered them, redirecting belief toward paths deemed acceptable.
Media played its role with precision. Stories of exceptional success were amplified, framed as proof of fairness. Failure was individualized, stripped of context. The rulebook loved exceptions. They served as evidence against its existence. If they made it, the story went, anyone can. The rulebook thrived on this logic, knowing that exceptions distract from patterns. Over time, people adjusted their expectations without realizing why. They aimed lower, compromised earlier, settled quietly. The rulebook rarely needed force. It relied on fatigue, on the slow erosion of belief, on the realization that pushing against invisible resistance consumed more energy than most could spare. Compliance became survival. Yet some refused to stop noticing. They compared stories. They traced outcomes across communities. They asked why similar effort produced different results. These people were often dismissed as troublemakers, accused of seeing injustice where none existed. But they had read between the lines long enough to recognize the shape of the rulebook, even if they could not hold it in their hands. Attempts to expose the rulebook were met with discomfort rather than debate. Conversations stalled. Institutions promised review without revision. Progress was acknowledged abstractly, delayed practically. The rulebook adapted, evolving language without altering structure. Terms changed, outcomes didn't. The most painful truth was not that the rulebook existed, but that many benefited from it unknowingly. Good people participated simply by moving within the system as designed. Silence became complicity, not from malice, but from convenience. Reading the rulebook required accepting responsibility, not just for outcomes, but for inaction. Generations passed, each inheriting a slightly revised edition of the same unwritten text. Some rules softened, others hardened. Legal barriers fell, while economic ones rose. Access expanded in theory, narrowed in cost. The rulebook was never static. It learned from challenge. It survived by adapting faster than reform. And yet, cracks appeared. Data replaced anecdotes. Voices amplified across distance. Patterns once dismissed became undeniable. The rulebook's invisibility weakened as more people learned to name its effects. Awareness did not erase it, but it changed the conversation. Silence lost some of its power. The question was never whether the rulebook could be destroyed. It was whether it could be rewritten. That required collective effort, uncomfortable honesty, and the willingness to accept that fairness is not automatic. It must be engineered, protected, and maintained. It required moving beyond slogans into structure. The silent rulebook was never meant to be read. That was its design. But once enough people sensed its presence, its authority weakened. Rules that depend on secrecy collapse under scrutiny. The challenge was not exposure alone, but endurance, the patience to keep reading what was never meant to be seen. In the end, the rulebook did not disappear. It rarely does. But it lost its invisibility. And in that loss, something shifted. When people stop blaming themselves for systems designed to exclude, belief changes direction. It turns outward, demanding accountability instead of apology. The most dangerous thing for an unwritten rule is being spoken aloud. Because once named, it can no longer pretend to be natural. And once read, even imperfectly, it can finally be challenged.
From the beginning, hard work was sold as the universal key. The promise was simple and comforting. If you worked long enough, sacrificed enough, and stayed disciplined, success would eventually arrive. This belief crossed oceans, borders, and generations. It was whispered to children, stitched into speeches, and carved into cultural identity. It sounded fair, it felt moral, and for many it became a form of faith. But faith, when unexamined, can hide inconvenient truths.
Those who arrived with little clung to the promise fiercely. They rose before dawn, labored until their bodies protested, and accepted exhaustion as proof of virtue. Sweat became evidence of worth. Rest felt undeserved. The idea that effort alone could shape destiny made suffering meaningful. It transformed hardship into investment. Yet somewhere along the path, many noticed a quiet imbalance. Some worked just as hard or harder and still fell behind. Others seemed to advance with ease, as if lifted by invisible hands. The difference was rarely explained. When questions surfaced, answers were vague. Timing, luck, talent. The explanations shifted but never settled. What remained constant was the insistence that hard work was enough. That insistence protected the myth. It discouraged scrutiny. It implied that those who failed simply hadn't earned success yet, or worse, never would. The system did not need to defend itself. Belief did the work for it. Hard work mattered. That much was true. Without it, nothing moved forward. Roads were built by hands, not ideas. Crops were harvested through effort, not intention. Industries grew because people showed up day after day. But hard work functioned more like a ticket of entry than a guarantee of reward. It allowed participation, not victory. The real requirements, the unspoken ones, weighted beyond effort. Access was one of them. Not just access to jobs or education, but access to information. Knowing which opportunities were real and which were symbolic. Knowing where to apply pressure and where resistance was futile. This knowledge was unevenly distributed, passed quietly through families, communities, and networks. Those without it often wasted years pushing on doors that were never meant to open. Connections formed another requirement, not the transactional kind advertised in self-help books, but the organic kind built over time and trust, a recommendation that carried weight, a warning delivered early enough to matter, a name mentioned in the right room. These moments rarely appeared on resumes, yet they shaped outcomes decisively. Hard work created readiness. Connections decided timing. Then there was tolerance for risk. Failure is often praised as a learning experience, but only if it is survivable. Those with safety nets could afford to gamble. A failed business meant a lesson, not disaster. A wrong career move meant a detour, not a dead end. Others could not afford mistakes. For them, caution replaced experimentation. Hard work kept them stable, but stability rarely led to breakthroughs. Education was framed as the great equalizer, yet it carried its own conditions. Quality varied dramatically. Some learned critical thinking, mentorship, and confidence. Others learned compliance and endurance. Diplomas looked identical, but preparation was not. When competition intensified, subtle differences became decisive. Hard work earned degrees. It did not standardize opportunity. Geography also shaped outcomes. A job market in one city rewarded ambition. In another, it punished it. Proximity to capital, institutions, and influence mattered. Moving required resources. Staying limited options. Hard work did not move borders. It did not relocate industries. People adapted to environments that rewarded some forms of labor and ignored others.
Race, class, and identity added further layers. Bias did not announce itself openly. It appeared in lowered expectations, in extra scrutiny, in assumptions about competence or fit. Two people could deliver the same performance and receive different interpretations. Hard work produced results, but results were filtered through perception. Perception was rarely neutral. Time itself was a requirement. Not just time spent working, but time free from crisis. Progress requires continuity. Illness, family emergencies, discrimination, and instability disrupted momentum. Some could pause and recover, others lost ground permanently. Hard work during crisis looked different from hard work during calm, yet the system rarely distinguished between them.
Those who succeeded often credited effort alone. Their stories were sincere but incomplete. They remembered the hours worked, not the advantages assumed. They recalled obstacles overcome, not the ones avoided unknowingly. Their narratives reinforced the myth, not out of malice, but out of limited perspective. Success narrowed vision. It simplified memory. Meanwhile, those who worked relentlessly without reward internalized blame. They questioned their discipline, intelligence, and worth. The idea that effort was insufficient felt like personal failure. Admitting that the system demanded more than hard work threatened identity itself. It was easier to believe in deficiency than in imbalance. The myth punished doubters more than believers. Industries learned to exploit this belief. Long hours became proof of loyalty. Burnout was reframed as dedication. Overwork replaced fairness. Workers competed not for innovation, but for endurance. Hard work became currency, even when it produced diminishing returns. Questioning the arrangement felt like weakness. Generationally, the gap widened. Those whose effort compounded passed advantages forward. Those whose effort merely sustained could not. Children inherited starting points shaped by decades of invisible requirements. Hard work restarted the race each generation, but starting lines were never equal. The myth pretended otherwise. Moments of clarity emerged during crises. Economic collapses, pandemics, and social upheavals exposed structural fragility. Hard-working people lost everything overnight. Others recovered quickly. The difference was not effort, it was protection. Systems revealed themselves under stress. Belief faltered briefly, then reassembled. Some began to speak differently. They acknowledged effort without worshiping it. They recognized skill without ignoring context. They argued that hard work should be rewarded but not mythologized, that opportunity should not depend on proximity to power. These conversations were uncomfortable. They challenged long-held identities. They demanded humility from winners and validation for those overlooked. The goal was never to dismiss effort. Without it, nothing meaningful exists. But effort alone cannot carry the weight of fairness. When hard work is framed as the only requirement, everything else becomes invisible. Privilege, access, protection, timing, and bias. The myth simplifies success and obscures responsibility. A more honest story recognizes complexity. It admits that systems shape outcomes, that people do not start equal, that fairness requires design, not slogans. Hard work should open doors, not justify locked ones. It should be a foundation, not a filter. When effort is paired with access, it thrives. When paired with protection, it compounds. When paired with recognition, it transforms. Without these, it sustains, but rarely elevates. This is not a failure of character, but of structure. The most dangerous version of the myth is not that hard work matters, it does, but that it is sufficient. That belief allows inequality to hide behind virtue. It absolves systems of responsibility and places the burden entirely on individuals. It turns survival into morality and success into proof of worth. A society built on effort alone would collapse. Cooperation, inheritance, infrastructure, and institutions all contradict the myth. Acknowledging this does not weaken ambition, it grounds it. It creates space for reform without resentment. It honors labor without exploiting it. Hard work was never the only requirement. It was simply the one spoken aloud. The others operated quietly, shaping trajectories without accountability. To name them is not to deny effort, but to protect it from being wasted. True opportunity begins when effort meets fairness. Until then, hard work remains necessary, but never enough.
Every dream needs builders. Before it can be celebrated, it must be constructed, slowly, painfully, and often invisibly.
The American dream did not rise fully formed from speeches or ideals. It was assembled plank by plank, mile by mile, generation by generation. Its foundations were laid by people whose names rarely appeared in headlines, whose faces rarely entered portraits, and whose lives were rarely remembered once the structure stood tall. They built the dream, but they were never invited to live inside it. From the earliest moments of expansion, labor came before legend. Roads were carved through wilderness long before maps declared opportunity. Fields were cleared before towns existed to benefit from them. Fortunes were imagined before they were earned. Someone always arrived first, not to claim, but to prepare. These people did not chase glory, they chased survival. And survival, unlike success, leaves little room for celebration. The dream promised arrival, but many lived permanently in transit. They moved with seasons, with contracts, with necessity. Wherever work appeared, they followed. Wherever opportunity faded, they disappeared. Their labor was essential, yet their presence was treated as temporary, even when it lasted a lifetime. The dream depended on their mobility, but denied them stability. Indigenous peoples were the first builders displaced by their own land. Long before fences and deeds, they shaped landscapes with knowledge refined over centuries. They managed ecosystems, built trade networks, cultivated food systems, and sustained communities in balance with the environment. Their labor did not extract, it preserved. Yet when the dream arrived, their work was redefined as absence. Progress framed them as obstacles, not architects. Their contributions were erased so that expansion could appear original. As settlers moved westward, they encountered land already prepared, paths already known, resources already understood. This silent inheritance was never acknowledged. Instead, ownership replaced stewardship, labor replaced relationship, and the people who had built sustainable systems were pushed aside so a different vision could take root, one that measured success by accumulation rather than continuity. Enslaved Black Americans built the physical infrastructure of early prosperity. They cleared land, constructed buildings, cultivated crops, and transported goods. Their labor generated wealth they were forbidden to own. Even when freedom arrived on paper, exclusion followed in practice. Laws changed names but preserved hierarchies. Black labor remained essential, but Black advancement remained conditional. The dream welcomed their effort but denied their presence. In mining camps, rail yards, farms, and households, Black workers performed the most dangerous and least rewarded tasks. They were hired last, paid least, and blamed first. Their labor sustained industries that celebrated independence while enforcing dependence. The dream expanded on their backs, yet its doors remained closed. Chinese migrants arrived driven by desperation and hope, crossing oceans to escape famine, war, and collapse. They built railroads through mountains, laid tracks across frozen terrain, and maintained infrastructure others abandoned. Their labor connected continents, their presence unsettled communities. When their labor was needed, they were tolerated. When success threatened competition, they were excluded. Violence and law worked together to push them out. Entire communities were erased overnight. Businesses burned, lives disrupted. Their labor remained embedded in the landscape, tracks that carried commerce, towns that survived because of their work, while their stories vanished. The dream remembered the achievement, but forgot the builders. Mexican and Latin American workers experienced a different erasure. Many never migrated at all. The border moved instead. Land that had been home became contested. Ownership was questioned. Rights were revoked. Courts redefined identity through language and paperwork.
Those who had built livelihoods over generations were suddenly labeled outsiders. Their labor sustained agriculture, ranching, mining, and trade, yet legal systems transformed contribution into vulnerability. Violence enforced exclusion where paperwork failed. The dream did not adapt to include them, it restructured itself to remove them. Women built the social architecture of the dream. While men chased opportunity, women stabilized chaos. They created schools, nursed the sick, organized communities, and preserved culture. Their labor was constant but rarely counted. Domestic work was essential, yet unpaid. Caregiving was necessary, yet unpaid. Without women, settlements would have collapsed. With them, success was attributed elsewhere. Women of color faced compounded exclusion. Their labor was exploited, their bodies controlled, their voices silenced. They endured violence without protection and responsibility without recognition. History recorded their presence only when convenient and often distorted it when it did. Children were not spared. They worked fields, factories, and mines before understanding what work meant. Childhood bent to necessity. Education became optional. Survival became priority. The dream demanded productivity without patience. Innocence was treated as expendable. Environmental destruction followed the same pattern. Rivers were poisoned, forests stripped, land exhausted. Those who benefited rarely lived near the damage. Those who labored remained. Illness followed extraction. Poverty followed collapse. The dream externalized its costs and localized its rewards. Legal systems enforced belonging selectively. Property laws protected accumulation. Labor laws protected profit. Citizenship defined access. Courts upheld exclusion with bureaucratic precision. Violence became policy when law proved insufficient. Justice served the dream, not the builders. Those who questioned the arrangement were dismissed as bitter or ungrateful. Gratitude was expected for opportunity, even when opportunity never arrived. Silence became survival strategy. Resistance carried consequences. The dream rewarded compliance more than contribution. Over time, myths replaced memory. Stories celebrated courage without acknowledging cost. Success was framed as destiny rather than design. Failure was personalized. The builders faded into background noise. Their absence was mistaken for insignificance. Yet without them, nothing stood. Cities rested on their labor. Wealth flowed through structures they built. Comfort relied on systems they maintained. Their exclusion was not accidental, it was structural. Inclusion would have required redistribution, recognition, and restraint. The dream chose expansion instead. Generations passed and the pattern persisted. New builders arrived. Old ones were forgotten. The dream evolved in language, but not in logic. Opportunity remained conditional. Belonging remained selective. To remember the builders is to challenge the myth of self-made success. It is to acknowledge that achievement is collective, even when credit is not. It is to recognize that exclusion is not failure, it is design. The dream did not accidentally forget its builders. It depended on their absence to maintain hierarchy. Honoring them does not diminish ambition, it clarifies it. It demands that opportunity be measured not by rhetoric, but by access, that success be shared, not hoarded, that history be told with honesty rather than comfort. The people who built the dream were never invited in, but they were never absent. They lived in the margins, in the foundations, in the quiet endurance that made celebration possible. Their legacy is embedded in every road, every city, every industry that claims greatness. To tell their story is not to reject the dream, it is to finish it. A dream that excludes its builders is incomplete, and a future that remembers them has a chance to be different.
Failure was never supposed to be part of the American dream. The dream promised that effort would be rewarded, that persistence would overcome obstacles, and that anyone willing to work hard enough could carve success from opportunity. When success did not arrive, the explanation was simple and unforgiving. The individual must have failed. The system itself was rarely questioned. In this way, failure became moralized. It was not a consequence of circumstance, inequality, or design. It was treated as a personal defect. This belief took hold early. As settlers moved westward, success stories were elevated into proof of fairness. A farmer who prospered became evidence that land was generous. A miner who struck gold became confirmation that fortune favored effort. Those who failed to thrive were quietly blamed for lacking discipline, intelligence, or courage. Structural limits were invisible. Individual shortcomings were visible and convenient. The dream required this framing to survive. If failure could be explained as personal weakness, then the promise itself remained intact. The system itself was rarely questioned. Inequality did not have to be justified. The dream stayed pure, untouched by contradiction. Those who struggled internalized shame rather than questioning the conditions that made success so rare. Opportunity in the 19th century West was never evenly distributed. Access to land depended on timing, capital, and legal recognition. Access to credit depended on race, reputation, and connections. Access to safety depended on geography and status. Yet the narrative insisted that the field was level. When people stumbled, they were told to try harder, not to ask why the ground beneath them was uneven. Miners learned this lesson quickly. Gold was governed by chance, not effort. Two men could work identical claims with identical tools and identical determination. One might strike fortune, the other might find nothing. Yet failure was never attributed to randomness. The man who found nothing was said to lack persistence or vision. He stayed longer, dug deeper, exhausted himself, and blamed his own inadequacy when success never arrived. Leaving felt like admission of failure. Staying felt like proof of commitment. The dream encouraged endurance even when endurance guaranteed loss. Men stayed in camps long after logic suggested departure. They worked until bodies broke. When they returned home empty-handed, their silence spoke louder than any explanation. They carried shame instead of stories. Farmers faced similar judgments. Droughts, floods, and infestations destroyed livelihoods without warning. Markets fluctuated beyond local control. Debt accumulated silently. When farms failed, neighbors whispered about poor planning or laziness. Rarely did anyone speak of weather patterns, railroad monopolies, or exploitative credit systems. Failure was individualized, not contextualized. This logic extended into urban labor as cities grew. Workers were hired under brutal conditions, paid wages that barely sustained survival, and dismissed without protection. Injuries ended careers. Illness erased income. When workers fell into poverty, they were labeled irresponsible. Hard work had been offered as a promise. When it failed to deliver, the worker, not the promise, was blamed. For marginalized communities, this framing was especially cruel. Black Americans were told that freedom meant opportunity, yet faced laws and violence that restricted movement, employment, and ownership. When success remained elusive, failure was attributed to character rather than exclusion. The dream spoke of equality while enforcing hierarchy. Those locked out were told the door was open if they tried harder. Chinese migrants were judged by the same standard. They worked relentlessly, often in the most dangerous conditions, yet remained targets of resentment. When they struggled, they were accused of undercutting wages or refusing assimilation. Their exclusion was portrayed as consequence, not design. Failure became justification for further exclusion. Mexican and indigenous laborers faced similar narratives. When land was taken, livelihoods destroyed, and rights revoked,
Their resulting poverty was framed as backwardness or incapacity. The dream erased its own role in their displacement. Survival itself was treated as insufficient effort. Women were held to contradictory standards. They were expected to support households, raise children, and maintain stability without economic power or legal autonomy. When families collapsed under pressure, women were blamed for moral weakness or domestic failure. Structural constraints disappeared from the story. Responsibility remained. Children inherited these judgments early. Education was framed as opportunity, yet access varied widely. Those who worked instead of studying were later criticized for lacking ambition. The dream ignored necessity. It measured worth by outcome, not by starting point. Over time, this framing reshaped identity. Success became evidence of virtue. Failure became evidence of deficiency. Compassion weakened. Solidarity fractured. People competed not only for resources, but for moral legitimacy. To struggle was to risk judgment. To admit difficulty was to expose weakness. This mindset protected power. If systems could not fail, then those who benefited from them did not have to change. Wealth appeared earned rather than inherited. Poverty appeared deserved rather than imposed. The dream became a mirror that reflected virtue upward and blame downward. Yet cracks appeared. Stories accumulated quietly, of effort without reward, of persistence without progress. These stories were rarely told publicly. Shame kept them private. Silence maintained the illusion. The emotional cost was immense. People internalized failure as identity. Self-worth eroded. Hope narrowed. Communities fragmented. Instead of collective action, individuals retreated inward, convinced their struggles were personal rather than shared. The dream demanded optimism but punished honesty. To question the system was to appear bitter. To critique inequality was to reject opportunity. Gratitude became mandatory. Silence became survival. Over generations, the narrative evolved, but the logic remained. Success stories multiplied. Failure stories disappeared. Media amplified winners. Losers faded into statistics or stereotypes. The dream grew louder. Its costs grew quieter. Yet failure was never purely individual. It was shaped by access, timing, identity, and design. Hard work mattered, but it was never the only requirement. The dream ignored this truth because acknowledging it would require responsibility. To reframe failure is to reclaim humanity. It is to recognize that struggle does not indicate weakness, and that success does not guarantee virtue. It is to see systems as constructed, not natural. Change becomes possible only when blame is redistributed honestly. The people labeled failures were not lacking effort. They were navigating barriers designed to remain invisible. Their stories challenge the dream's simplicity. They reveal its conditions. When failure was framed as a personal flaw, inequality was preserved as fate. But when failure is understood as structural, possibility expands. Responsibility shifts. Compassion returns. The dream does not have to disappear, but it must be redefined, not as a promise of guaranteed success, but as a commitment to fairness, access, and dignity. A dream that survives only by blaming the vulnerable is not a dream worth preserving. The people who carried the weight of failure were never failures themselves. They were witnesses to limits unspoken, rules unwritten, and systems unchallenged. Their experiences formed the missing chapter of the dream. To listen to them is to begin again, not with illusion, but with understanding. And understanding, unlike blame, creates the possibility of something better.
The promise was rarely spoken directly to families, yet they carried its weight more than anyone else. It arrived disguised as opportunity, whispered through letters, newspapers, sermons, and conversations held late at night. It promised that sacrifice would be temporary,
that absence would be justified, that struggle would lead somewhere better. It assured families that separation was an investment, not a loss. And so they agreed, sometimes eagerly, sometimes reluctantly, to pay a price they could not yet measure. The American dream often addressed individuals, but it extracted its cost from households. Men left first, carrying ambition and hope westward. Families stayed behind, holding routines together with uncertainty stitched into every day. Fields were tended by fewer hands. Children learned early how to wait. Wives learned how to manage silence. The endurance insisted that endurance now would secure stability later. Time, however, rarely honored that timeline. For many families, departure was not dramatic. It was practical. A wagon packed, a goodbye spoken quickly to avoid doubt. The promise framed absence as responsibility. Leaving was described as love expressed through risk. Those who stayed behind accepted this logic because rejecting it felt like rejecting the future itself. They believed they were part of something larger, something meaningful. That belief sustained them through the early weeks. Weeks became months. Letters arrived irregularly, often optimistic, often vague. They spoke of near success, of opportunities just missed, of one more season before returning home. Families learned to read between lines. They learned to recognize exaggeration as reassurance. Silence stretched longer than words. Each letter reset the clock, asking for more patience. Children grew in increments measured by absence. Fathers missed first steps, first words, first days of school. Mothers became translators of memory, describing a parent who existed more in stories than in presence. The promise asked families to treat absence as temporary, even when it began to feel permanent. Childhood adapted around that absence, reshaping expectations and relationships. For those who followed west, the cost was immediate and visible. Mining camps, frontier towns, and railroad settlements were not designed for families. Housing was unstable, food was expensive, safety was uncertain. Children lived among risk, open pits, disease, violence, and scarcity. Mothers carried responsibility without authority. Domestic labor multiplied under harsh conditions. The promise did not account for caregiving. Illness tested families brutally. Medical care was scarce and unreliable. An infection that might have been survivable elsewhere could become fatal. Families watched loved ones weaken without recourse. Grief arrived suddenly and lingered indefinitely. The promise offered no compensation for loss. It had no provision for mourning. Economic instability fractured households quietly. Income fluctuated unpredictably. A successful season could be followed by ruin. Families learned to not trust good news too deeply. Debt accumulated invisibly. Decisions were made without certainty. Anxiety became routine. The promise encouraged optimism while delivering instability. Some families fractured under pressure. Prolonged separation eroded intimacy. Reunions felt unfamiliar. Spouses became strangers shaped by different realities. Children struggled to reconnect with parents who returned changed, physically worn, emotionally distant, or permanently altered by labor and disappointment. The promise had no language for reintegration. Women bore a disproportionate share of the cost. They managed finances, households, children, and emotional labor simultaneously. Their contributions were framed as support rather than leadership. When families failed to prosper, blame often settled on domestic mismanagement rather than structural hardship. The promise relied on women's resilience while denying their agency. For marginalized families, the cost was compounded.
Black families faced constant threat of separation through violence, discriminatory laws, and economic exclusion. Even when opportunity appeared, it was unstable and conditional. Families learned to expect loss. Stability became a luxury. The promise spoke of freedom while enforcing precarity. Indigenous families experienced the promise as destruction. Removal policies fractured kinship networks. Children were taken from parents in the name of assimilation. Cultural transmission was interrupted deliberately. Families paid with language, tradition, and continuity. The promise did not see these losses as relevant. Progress measured land, not lives. Chinese immigrant families endured separation across oceans. Many men arrived alone, intending to return home once money was earned. Laws prevented reunification. Hostility prevented stability. Families existed across distance indefinitely. Children grew without parents. Parents aged without children. The promise transformed temporary separation into permanent fracture. Mexican and Latin American families navigated shifting borders that redefined belonging overnight. Legal changes disrupted property ownership and inheritance. Families who had lived on land for generations found themselves displaced. Stability dissolved without movement. The promise arrived not as invitation, but as force. The emotional toll accumulated quietly. Families normalized stress, grief, and uncertainty. Survival required emotional restraint. Vulnerability felt dangerous. Expressing doubt threatened morale. The promise demanded belief, even when belief caused pain. Faith communities, extended families, and neighbors attempted to fill gaps. Informal networks emerged to support those left behind. These systems provided resilience, but also revealed the scale of absence. Community support became necessary precisely because the promise failed to provide security. Some families did benefit. A minority achieved stability or wealth. Their stories circulated widely, reinforcing belief in the promise. Their success became evidence that sacrifice worked. The many families who paid without return faded from collective memory. Their suffering became invisible. As generations passed, the cost was reframed as character building. Hardship was romanticized. Endurance became virtue. Families who struggled were praised for resilience rather than supported for recovery. The promise avoided accountability by celebrating survival instead of addressing harm. The psychological inheritance persisted. Children raised in instability internalized caution. They learned not to expect security. Risk became normalized. Trust in systems weakened. The promise shaped not only outcomes, but worldviews. Families that paid the price were rarely asked for consent. The promise was presented as inevitability. To refuse participation was to risk stagnation. Opting out felt irresponsible. Families accepted risk not because it was fair, but because alternatives were limited. The true cost of the promise cannot be measured economically. It resides in missed relationships, unresolved grief, altered trajectories, and generational stress. Families invested in a future that did not arrive as promised. They adapted instead. Yet these families were not passive victims. They exercised agency within constraint. They supported one another. They rebuilt after loss. They created meaning where reward was absent. Their labor sustained communities and economies even when recognition was denied. Remembering them requires reframing success. It requires acknowledging that progress was built not only by ambition, but by endurance forced upon those with little choice. The promise functioned because families absorbed its failures privately. To honor these families is not to reject hope, but to demand honesty. It is to recognize that dreams that rely on sacrifice must account for those who pay. It is to see families not as background figures, but as central actors in history. The American dream did not simply lift individuals. It leaned heavily on families willing or compelled to endure instability, separation, and loss. Their contribution was not incidental, it was foundational. Families that paid the price were not failures. They were participants in a promise that asked more than it delivered. Their stories reveal the true cost of aspiration and the necessity of accountability. If the dream is to continue, it must change. It must protect families rather than consume them. It must value care as much as ambition. It must recognize that prosperity achieved at the expense of family stability is incomplete. The families who paid the price remind us that progress is not abstract, it is lived, it is felt, and it is carried forward quietly across generations. Their legacy is not wealth, but endurance, and endurance, once seen clearly, demands something better in return.
Every nation celebrates its success stories. They are clean, confident, and comforting. They suggest that effort leads to reward, that courage is eventually recognized, and that progress is fair in its distribution. In the American imagination, success stories became proof that the dream worked. They were repeated in newspapers, memoirs, speeches, and classrooms. But beneath many of these stories lived an unspoken requirement: silence. Silence about who was displaced, who labored unseen, who absorbed the cost so that success could appear simple and deserved. Success rarely announced what it depended on. It did not describe the conditions that made it possible. It did not mention whose absence cleared the way, whose voices were ignored, or whose losses were necessary. The louder the celebration, the quieter these truths became. Over time, silence was not accidental. It became structural. Success stories learned to survive by excluding discomfort. In the 19th century West, success was often framed as individual triumph. A man arrived with little, worked hard, endured hardship, and emerged prosperous. This narrative was compelling precisely because it felt moral. It suggested fairness. But the land he claimed was rarely empty. The labor that supported him was rarely acknowledged. The risks he survived were often transferred to others. His success required a surrounding quiet, a world of people whose experiences were erased so his story could remain uncomplicated. Land ownership was the foundation of many celebrated successes. Homesteads, farms, ranches, and businesses flourished on territory that had been inhabited, cultivated, and protected for generations by indigenous nations. These prior histories were treated as obstacles rather than realities. Removal, broken treaties, and violence were reframed as inevitabilities. Success depended on forgetting what came before. Silence transformed dispossession into opportunity. Gold Rush narratives followed a similar pattern. Popular stories focused on discovery, perseverance, and reward. They did not dwell on the thousands who found nothing. They did not describe the environmental destruction, the labor exploitation, or the racial violence that accompanied mining. Successful miners became symbols of possibility. Their wealth appeared earned and clean. The silence around failure and harm made success feel deserved rather than accidental. Railroads offered some of the most celebrated success stories of the era. They symbolized progress, connection, and national ambition. Industrialists were praised as visionaries,
What went largely unspoken was the labor that made the railroads possible. Chinese workers blasted tunnels, laid track, and died in significant numbers. Their suffering was not included in the narrative of achievement. Their presence was treated as temporary. The railroad's success required their silence. Entrepreneurial success also relied on unacknowledged systems of advantage. Access to credit, legal protection, and political influence determined who could expand and who could not. Merchants who thrived benefited from networks that excluded others by race, gender, or class. Their stories emphasized risk-taking and intelligence, not the barriers faced by those denied entry. Silence converted privilege into merit. Violence was often erased from success narratives. Towns that prospered frequently did so after conflict, forced removal, or intimidation. Vigilante justice eliminated competition. Legal systems reinforced inequality. When order was restored, prosperity followed. The success story began after the violence ended, not while it occurred. Silence cleaned the timeline. For Black Americans, success was tightly constrained. A few individuals achieved recognition despite overwhelming obstacles. Their stories were held up as proof of opportunity. What was left unsaid was how exceptional their circumstances were and how many others were blocked entirely. Success stories required silence about systemic exclusion. They implied that failure resulted from lack of effort rather than lack of access. Women's success stories were similarly filtered. When women prospered, it was often through alignment with male achievement, supporting businesses, maintaining households, stabilizing communities. Their labor was essential, but categorized as background. When women succeeded independently, their stories were minimized or framed as anomalies. Silence preserved the illusion that success followed a single, masculine path. Immigrant success stories became central to the national myth. Tales of arrival, hardship, and eventual prosperity reinforced belief in upward mobility. Yet these stories often omitted the hostility, discrimination, and legal barriers immigrants faced. Success required navigating exclusion while appearing grateful. Silence became a survival strategy. Speaking openly risked retaliation or loss of opportunity. Even environmental damage was muted in narratives of success. Cities expanded, industries flourished, and wealth accumulated while rivers were poisoned, forests stripped, and land permanently altered. These costs were externalized. Success stories focused on growth, not consequence. Silence allowed prosperity to appear sustainable. The most effective success stories were selective. They highlighted persistence while ignoring attrition. For every celebrated outcome, countless attempts ended quietly. Those who failed disappeared from the narrative. Their absence reinforced the idea that success was common rather than rare. Silence inflated possibility. Over time, silence became inherited. Children learned simplified histories. Textbooks emphasized progress over pain. Museums displayed artifacts without context. Commemoration favored triumph. The quiet around suffering hardened into tradition. Success stories became cultural anchors protected from scrutiny. This silence was not neutral. It shaped policy, belief, and expectation. If success was always attainable, then failure required explanation. Responsibility shifted to individuals. Structural barriers vanished from view. Silence justified inequality by denying its origins. The success stories that endured were not false, but incomplete. They told what happened to a few while ignoring what happened to many. They measured achievement without measuring cost. Their power came from what they excluded. Yet silence also demanded maintenance. It required forgetting, minimizing, or dismissing alternative perspectives. It resisted complexity. It discouraged questioning. Those who challenged success narratives were labeled ungrateful, divisive, or unpatriotic. Silence defended itself. For those who benefited, silence felt comfortable. It preserved dignity and legitimacy. For those excluded, silence felt imposed. Speaking risked backlash. Survival often meant quiet endurance. Success stories thrived in this imbalance. The irony is that many celebrated successes were made possible precisely because others were silenced. Cheap labor, displaced communities, unprotected environments, and unequal laws created conditions for accumulation. Success did not occur despite injustice. It often depended on it. Recognizing this does not erase achievement. It contextualizes it. It restores humanity to those omitted. It challenges the idea that success exists in isolation. It demands accountability rather than admiration alone. Silence shaped memory, but it did not erase truth. Evidence remains in landscapes, records, oral histories, and generational trauma. The quiet was never complete. It only delayed recognition. Today, success stories are still told. They still inspire, but they carry responsibility. To tell them honestly requires acknowledging who paid, who waited, who was excluded, and who was erased. It requires expanding the frame. The success stories that needed silence to exist reveal something essential. Progress without reflection is fragile. Prosperity without inclusion is unstable. Achievement without accountability is incomplete. Breaking the silence does not diminish success. It deepens understanding. It transforms admiration into awareness. It replaces myth with memory. The American dream does not fail because some succeed. It fails when success requires silence. A future built on honest stories, stories that include cost as well as gain, offers something stronger than myth: integrity. The challenge is not to stop celebrating success, but to stop demanding silence in exchange for it. When stories make room for everyone involved, they become more than symbols. They become lessons. Only then can success exist without requiring someone else to disappear.
Inequality is not only a matter of wealth, opportunity, or law, it is also a matter of place. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and forests shaped not just the movement of people, but the distribution of resources and power. Geography dictated access to opportunity, the visibility of labor, and the concentration of wealth. Across the 19th and 20th centuries, as settlers, migrants, and dreamers moved across the North American continent, the land itself amplified disparities. This is the story of how the terrain of opportunity created the landscape of inequality, and how people navigated it. The first waves of westward expansion revealed the relationship between land and power. Fertile valleys, navigable rivers, and temperate climates attracted settlers eager to farm, trade, and claim property. Land that was productive became valuable. Land that was difficult to reach or cultivate remained in the hands of indigenous communities, later forcibly taken or marginalized. Geography was not neutral. It favored those with knowledge, capital, or access to transportation. Inequality followed natural contours as easily as it followed human law. Rivers became both lifelines and boundaries. Towns flourished along the Mississippi, the Columbia, and the Missouri because water allowed commerce and travel. Communities far from navigable waterways struggled to grow. Farmers in arid plains faced scarcity of water, while those in river valleys benefited from irrigation and trade. The success of one community could often be traced to the presence of a single geographic feature, a bend in a river, a fertile floodplain,
while others, equally industrious, faltered simply because the land refused them the same advantages. Mountains imposed both challenge and opportunity. Settlers who crossed the Rockies or the Appalachians discovered hidden valleys where settlement was possible, yet the passes were dangerous, and winter often made transportation impossible. Communities established in such regions often remained isolated, dependent on local resources, and vulnerable to environmental shocks. In contrast, those who arrived in lowlands or along trade routes could leverage mobility to accumulate wealth and influence. Geography dictated who could prosper and who would remain constrained. Deserts, too, defined inequality. The harsh expanses of the Southwest discouraged mass settlement. Only those with capital, knowledge, or technological solutions, wells, canals, and irrigation systems, could thrive. Others, lacking resources or access, were relegated to marginal lands or forced into labor supporting those who had successfully claimed the fertile oases. Geography reinforced social hierarchies. To control the water was to control opportunity. Access to transportation determined economic mobility. Towns connected to railroads, ports, and roads gained commercial advantage, while isolated settlements remained dependent, often impoverished, and subject to exploitation. Railroads did not only carry goods, they carried power. Those who controlled the rails dictated the movement of resources, labor, and information. Inequality followed the tracks as surely as it followed the riverbanks. Urban centers reflected geographic advantage in concentrated form. Cities built near harbors or rivers became hubs of trade, finance, and industry. Immigrant labor was drawn to these hubs, yet the distribution of opportunity within them was highly uneven. Neighborhoods formed along both economic and ethnic lines, often determined by access to streets, transportation, or land value. Proximity to water, markets, or rail stations translated into better wages, education, and property values. Geography codified social and economic divisions. Natural resources shaped inequality as well. Coal, timber, minerals, and fertile soil were unequally distributed across the continent. Settlers and corporations exploited these resources, often displacing indigenous communities or marginalizing local populations. Regions rich in extractable wealth became centers of boom, while resource-poor areas remained overlooked. Geography decided not only the presence of opportunity, but also who could access it. Environmental hazards also magnified inequality. Floodplains, fire-prone forests, and earthquake zones created risk that was unequally shared. Wealthy landowners often secured protective infrastructure, while marginalized communities endured the consequences of exposure. Disaster and opportunity were not separate, they were entwined, with geography determining who bore the cost and who benefited. Geography intersected with legal structures to reinforce inequality. Land grants, property laws, and settlement policies favored those in geographically advantageous positions. Policies such as the Homestead Act or railroad subsidies did not treat all land equally. They targeted areas where settlement and extraction were deemed feasible or profitable. Legal frameworks codified geographic advantage, turning natural disparities into systemic inequality. Indigenous populations experienced this dynamic most acutely. Their traditional territories often contained the resources that settlers sought, yet the geography of their lands, forests, deserts, and mountains was reframed as obstacles to progress. Treaties, displacement, and forced relocation systematically removed indigenous communities from areas that settlers valued most. Geography, which had once ensured sustenance and cultural cohesion, became a vector for dispossession. Immigrant communities navigated geography under constrained circumstances. Cities and towns offered opportunity, but housing and labor markets were geographically segregated. Immigrants were often confined to neighborhoods that lacked services, faced environmental hazards, and were far from centers of power.
Their proximity to work dictated access to wages, yet it also constrained mobility. Geography shaped both survival and limitation. Rural inequality mirrored urban disparities in different form. Isolated farms, frontier settlements, and remote communities faced challenges of access to education, healthcare, and markets. Distance amplified scarcity. Those who could adapt through mechanization, community cooperation, or external connections could mitigate geographic disadvantage, but many remained trapped by the natural contours of their environment. Economic specialization arose from geographic circumstance. Agricultural valleys produced crops, mining towns extracted resources, and ports handled trade. Each region's wealth was contingent on local geography, yet the benefits were unevenly distributed. Workers often labored in perilous conditions for the profit of distant owners. Geography amplified the distance between risk and reward. Infrastructure development partially mitigated geographic inequality, but often in ways that reinforced existing hierarchies. Roads, bridges, and canals facilitated commerce for those already positioned to benefit. Marginalized communities sometimes gained access, but more often served as conduits for wealth extraction. Geography's constraints persisted, shaped by both natural features and human decision-making. Education and knowledge followed geography as well. Urban centers with concentrated wealth offered schools and libraries, while remote areas struggled to sustain institutions. Access to information dictated economic and social mobility, reinforcing geographic disparities. Inequality was embedded not just in land or resources, but in the pathways of learning and opportunity. Over time, migration patterns reflected awareness of geographic advantage. Families, laborers, and entrepreneurs moved toward fertile valleys, rivers, railroads, and cities. Those unable to migrate remained limited, their possibilities bounded by location. Geography determined who could pursue opportunity and who could only observe it from a distance. Geography shaped politics too. Electoral power, local governance, and policy decisions often favored regions of concentrated population and wealth. Rural or marginalized communities had less influence over decisions that affected them, while prosperous regions reinforced their own advantages through legislation. Geography created political as well as economic inequality. Cultural development was also unevenly distributed. Communities with resources and geographic advantage could sustain theaters, art, and social institutions. Remote or disadvantaged areas often relied on oral traditions and improvisation. Geography influenced not only material wealth, but also cultural opportunity. Disasters made inequality visible. Floods, fires, and crop failures affected everyone, but the capacity to recover varied dramatically. Wealth and geographic advantage determined resilience, while isolation and marginalization increased vulnerability. Geography mediated both exposure and recovery, shaping long-term outcomes. Yet within these constraints, human ingenuity persisted. Communities adapted to mountains, deserts, and rivers. They built irrigation, terraced hillsides, and shelters. They created trade networks and mutual aid. Geography shaped inequality, but it did not entirely dictate destiny. Knowledge, cooperation, and persistence could mitigate some of its harshest effects. The geography of inequality is not a relic of the past. Even today, natural features, settlement patterns, and infrastructure continue to define opportunity. Rivers, mountains, ports, and highways structure economic and social outcomes. Understanding the relationship between place and power is essential to addressing persistent inequities. Recognizing the geography of inequality also requires historical reflection. It means tracing the origins of advantage and disadvantage to both natural and human-made structures. It means acknowledging who benefited from particular terrains and who was excluded.
Only then can opportunity be reimagined in ways that are equitable. Ultimately, inequality is as much about location as it is about talent, effort, or ambition. The contours of land, the flow of water, and the placement of settlements all shape human outcomes. To address inequity, one must see the terrain as part of the problem, not merely as background. Geography is never neutral. It distributes advantage as clearly as law or custom. Success, failure, mobility, and poverty all intersect with the land. Rivers, mountains, plains, and deserts are both opportunity and limitation. To understand history, to build policy, or to imagine a more equitable future, the geography of inequality must be mapped, acknowledged, and addressed. Only by seeing how place shapes possibility can the promise of equality be made real.
In every society, there are those who follow the rules, who believe that diligence, honesty, and patience will guarantee security, respect, and opportunity. They pay their debts, honor agreements, and uphold traditions, trusting that adherence to expectations will yield reward. Yet history is filled with the stark truth that following the rules is no shield against misfortune, exploitation, or systemic inequity. Across towns, cities, farms, and mines, men and women discovered that compliance alone could not protect them from the currents of power, greed, and circumstance. This is the story of those who played by the rules and still lost. The earliest arrivals to burgeoning settlements carried hope in carefully packed bundles. Farmers migrated west with letters of credit, legal titles, and carefully calculated plans. Merchants kept meticulous ledgers, calculating risk with precision. These were people who understood the value of rules, contracts, and structure, and they trusted that rules were the framework of fairness. Yet the land rarely adhered to the expectations of settlers. Rivers flooded without regard for survey markers. Fires consumed cabins that met all codes. Lawmen were scarce, often partial or absent altogether. People who followed the legal requirements for property ownership discovered that a more ruthless competitor could still stake a claim, bribe an official, or seize their labor. Rules existed on paper, but power dictated reality. To play by the rules was to accept vulnerability. Laborers experienced this inequity most immediately. Men and women who worked long hours, completed tasks with skill, and submitted to strict hierarchies often found themselves denied recognition or wages. Employers invoked technicalities, blamed circumstances, or shifted debts to avoid payment. A contract could be written perfectly and still mean nothing if the other party ignored it. Hard work, obedience, and integrity were not guarantees of survival. They were prerequisites for exploitation. Communities developed informal hierarchies that enforced disadvantage on those who respected the rules. Those who sought to follow every law often became targets for those who exploited loopholes. Corruption thrived in the spaces between regulation and enforcement. Taxes were manipulated. Land claims were contested through procedural tricks. Those who followed the rules found themselves outmaneuvered by those who understood that the system rewarded cunning more than compliance. Families bore the brunt of systemic failures. Parents who educated their children, instilled discipline, and obeyed civic duties discovered that opportunities they expected might vanish. Schools were underfunded or segregated. Employment often bypassed merit in favor of favoritism or prejudice. Generations grew up learning the bitter lesson that playing fair did not always lead to prosperity, and that fairness was frequently the first casualty of ambition. Immigrant populations understood this lesson early. Arriving with visas, documents, and a commitment to lawful integration,
They found that local biases, legal loopholes, and informal barriers often rendered compliance insufficient. They worked jobs nobody else wanted, paid taxes, and followed laws meticulously, yet they were routinely passed over for advancement, denied credit, or expelled through bureaucratic technicalities. Playing by the rules did not equal protection. Workers in industrial towns learned that compliance could come at a cost. Factory laborers followed schedules, obeyed safety protocols, and adhered to union agreements. Yet machinery failures, poor ventilation, and management negligence meant accidents were frequent. Compensation was delayed or denied. Those who documented adherence to the rules often found themselves labeled troublesome. The system rewarded compliance in theory, but in practice, compliance was a vulnerability, not a shield. Miners were among the most vivid examples. Those who registered claims correctly, followed all protocols, and respected property boundaries were frequently undermined by rivals who bribed surveyors, moved markers, or ignored boundaries with impunity. Entire months of labor could be rendered meaningless by a single act of technical cheating, and the law, slow, inconsistent, or biased, rarely restored justice. The rules existed, but enforcement was inconsistent, selective, or absent. Small business owners experienced similar frustration. Merchants and shopkeepers who adhered to licensing regulations, paid fees, and followed trade laws still faced competitors who bypassed regulations through bribery or intimidation. A shopkeeper might invest in quality stock, maintain fair prices, and pay employees appropriately, only to be undercut by those who ignored restrictions, violated codes, or engaged in illegal smuggling. Honesty was not a path to security. It was a moral stance with financial consequences. Women who obeyed social and legal expectations often encountered parallel inequities. Mothers and wives who managed households, worked within accepted labor roles, or maintained propriety were nonetheless denied autonomy or recognition. Those who followed rules in employment, education, or property ownership often discovered that their compliance made them more visible and accountable, while others who disregarded norms escaped scrutiny. Playing by the rules was sometimes the first step toward personal disadvantage. Even in legal matters, compliance could be a trap. Plaintiffs who pursued lawsuits in good faith found courts overburdened, partial, or corrupt. Defendants who respected injunctions or settlements sometimes lost to aggressive tactics. Written contracts and sworn oaths could not compensate for bias, ignorance, or systemic failure. Justice, as the rule followers discovered, was often a question of circumstance, not principle. Communities themselves often penalized rule followers. Those who paid taxes, attended town meetings, and participated in civic duties were sometimes exploited by local authorities who applied ordinances unevenly. Tax collection could favor those with connections. Public services could be directed towards politically favored neighborhoods. In towns and settlements, following the rules was often synonymous with vulnerability, especially when those with influence ignored or distorted regulations. Education offered promise, but also revealed the fragility of compliance. Students who attended school, completed assignments, and respected academic codes were sometimes overlooked for scholarships or employment in favor of connections and favoritism. Merit was not always rewarded. Social networks and political advantage often dictated outcomes. Following the rules did not guarantee access, it guaranteed visibility, sometimes dangerous visibility. Even in religion and moral society, compliance did not guarantee reward. Churches, charitable organizations, and fraternal groups praised obedience and virtue, yet often overlooked the poor, marginalized, or socially disadvantaged. Those who contributed, followed ethical codes, and volunteered were sometimes excluded from decision-making or influence. Good conduct was appreciated rhetorically, but often ignored in tangible terms. Those who invested in property and land according to legal requirements discovered another cruel twist. Land could be expropriated through eminent domain, taxes misapplied, or bureaucratic errors. Mortgages and loans required absolute compliance, yet financial institutions sometimes mismanaged records or manipulated terms. Playing by the rules did not protect investment. It often exposed vulnerability. Labor movements highlighted the limits of adherence. Workers who struck legally, followed union protocols, and respected strike rules sometimes suffered retaliation, blacklisting, or company bankruptcy. Those who violated rules were punished. Those who complied were still victims of circumstance. Obedience alone could not ensure protection in the face of systemic inequality. Yet those who followed the rules persisted, motivated by principle, hope, or necessity. They documented their labor, honored agreements, and maintained integrity despite repeated setbacks. Their persistence demonstrates the resilience of individuals who seek fairness in an unfair world. Compliance was not always strategic. Sometimes it was the only course consistent with conscience. Stories of loss repeated across generations. Families who saved diligently, obeyed laws, and respected contracts often faced sudden disaster, a failed crop, a bank closure, a flood, a fire. Those who cheated or manipulated systems sometimes prospered, while the compliant suffered. Life seemed to reward cunning over conscience, exploitation over effort, and misfortune over morality. And yet, the record of the rule followers exists, even if history often ignores it. Letters, diaries, account books, and oral histories reveal lives lived in diligence and fairness. They teach that adherence to principle is valuable in its own right, even when external rewards are denied. The experience of losing despite compliance is not simply tragedy, it is a testament to endurance. In examining broader society, it becomes clear that systems amplify this paradox. Economic policies, governance structures, and social hierarchies frequently favor those who bend or circumvent rules. Those who play fair discover that fairness is contingent, sometimes irrelevant. Inequality is sustained not only by those who break rules, but institutions that allow uneven enforcement. Communities did, at times, recognize these injustices. Advocates, reformers, and journalists documented instances of rule followers who suffered despite diligence. Social reform movements sought to establish protections, strengthen oversight, and create accountability. Yet progress was uneven, slow, and incomplete. The lessons of compliance and loss were often acknowledged only in hindsight. In modern times, the principle remains. Individuals who follow guidelines, adhere to contracts, and respect norms still encounter systemic obstacles. The rule follower's dilemma persists wherever power, wealth, or influence is unevenly distributed. Compliance guarantees neither security nor recognition. It only ensures participation within a system whose fairness is always conditional. The enduring lesson is that playing by the rules is a moral choice, not a guarantee of success. It shapes character, maintains integrity, and fosters trust, but it cannot alone protect against exploitation, inequality, or circumstance. Those who played fair and still lost illuminate the limits of expectation, the fragility of order, and the resilience of conscience. Ultimately, the stories of these individuals challenge the narrative of meritocracy. Success is not simply a function of diligence or morality. It is shaped by context, circumstance, and the unpredictable interaction of power and opportunity. Those who played fair and still lost remind us that fairness is not inherent in law, labor, or social expectation. Fairness must be actively constructed, enforced, and protected, because the rules alone cannot guarantee it. And so their legacy remains, a quiet, uncelebrated testimony to the perseverance of principle, the endurance of integrity, and the stark reality that compliance is no safeguard against misfortune. Their stories form a mirror, reflecting the limits of systems and the necessity of justice beyond mere obedience. In honoring those who played by the rules and still lost, society recognizes the courage it takes to maintain integrity in a world that does not always reward it.
From the earliest days of the continent, promises were made in letters, speeches, and newspapers, promises of wealth, freedom, and opportunity. It were framed as truths, as guarantees, as the invisible hand guiding every traveler, settler, and migrant toward a better life. And yet, for every person who chased these promises, reality revealed something more complex. The dream was less a truth and more a tool, wielded to motivate, manipulate, and shape behavior. This is the story of those who learned to follow the dream and those who discovered its hidden purpose. When settlers first received news of fertile lands in the West, the language used was carefully constructed. The land was described as waiting, open, and empty, a canvas for anyone willing to work hard enough. In towns thousands of miles away, newspapers celebrated the potential of a new life. Every article, advertisement, and letter emphasized opportunity. To those who read them, it felt as though destiny itself was aligned with ambition. Families packed belongings, sold property, and left behind familiar lives, trusting that the dream was a path, a truth they could walk upon. The journey westward was grueling, and the dream served as both guide and burden. Families crossed deserts, navigated treacherous rivers, and climbed mountain passes, sustaining themselves on hope and promises of a better tomorrow. Children grew up too quickly. Parents endured hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Yet the dream remained vivid in their minds. Letters and newspapers reinforced it. Riches await the industrious. Freedom favors those who act. Your labor will be rewarded. The dream shaped decisions, dictated sacrifice, and provided a sense of moral imperative. Upon arrival, however, reality often contradicted expectation. Land was rarely as empty as described. Indigenous nations lived on, cultivated, and governed these regions. Water sources were claimed, territories disputed, and resources scarce. Laws existed, but enforcement was uneven, often favoring newcomers who had connections or capital. Those who had followed every instruction, paid dues, and adhered to permits found themselves confronted by circumstances that no amount of rule following could control. The dream did not guarantee success, it guaranteed obedience. Employers, politicians, and promoters quickly understood the power of the dream. It could drive migration, labor, and investment. It could motivate people to endure hardships that they might otherwise have resisted. Banks, land speculators, and mine owners framed the dream as evidence of opportunity, while simultaneously extracting wealth and labor from those chasing it. The dream was a tool, a mechanism to incentivize compliance, patience, and risk-taking. It worked because the promise was compelling, even when it was not fully attainable. In mining towns, the pattern was particularly stark. Prospectors believed in the promise of gold, in the idea that diligence and honesty would produce riches. Yet claims were contested, land boundaries manipulated, and access to water controlled by those with influence. A miner who had followed the rules, registered a claim properly, and worked tirelessly, often found a more unscrupulous competitor reaping the rewards. The dream had driven him there, motivated his sacrifice, but it had not ensured justice. The promise existed to spur action, not to deliver outcome. Farmers encountered a similar paradox. They purchased land advertised as fertile, with sufficient water and community support. Yet floods, droughts, pests, and market fluctuations undermined the promises made to them. Grain rotted in storage, debts accumulated,
and families struggled to survive. Those who had obeyed property laws, paid taxes, and adhered to local codes discovered that effort alone did not secure prosperity. The dream's language had motivated them, but it had been wielded as a tool of expectation, not a guarantor of truth. Communities reinforced this dynamic. Schools, churches, and civic organizations often celebrated the pursuit of the dream, praising industriousness, perseverance, and ambition. Yet they rarely accounted for the structural barriers, systemic biases, or unpredictable hardships that prevented equitable outcomes. Children were taught that hard work would yield success, even as the adults around them witnessed failure, despite adherence. In this way, the dream functioned as both promise and moral compass, a guide to behavior, a framework for judgment, and a tool of social control. Immigrant communities faced the dream's power as a double-edged sword. Chinese, Mexican, and European migrants arrived believing in opportunity and equality, only to encounter exclusion, legal restrictions, and social hostility. The dream promised inclusion and upward mobility, but in practice, it demanded assimilation, obedience, and resilience in the face of discrimination. The dream motivated labor and settlement while simultaneously masking inequities that perpetuated hierarchy and exploitation.
Women, too, navigated the tool-like nature of the dream. They managed households, raised children, and participated in labor while men pursued wealth or status. Society praised their effort, framed it within narratives of virtue and industriousness, but rarely granted them independent opportunity. The dream motivated them to support the ambitions of others, to uphold societal expectations, and to maintain hope even when their own prospects were constrained. Compliance became a survival strategy, yet reward remained uneven. The psychological impact of this manipulation was profound. Communities internalized the dream as truth. Failure was interpreted as moral weakness rather than circumstance. Sacrifice was valorized even when outcomes were unjust. Children grew up believing that misfortune was a consequence of insufficient effort, reinforcing obedience and compliance in the next generation. The dream's tool-like quality became embedded in the cultural imagination, a promise whose moral weight compelled behavior even when the outcomes were uncertain or unfair. Despite these challenges, the dream had tangible results. It motivated the settlement of territories, the construction of infrastructure, and the creation of towns and industries. Labor was mobilized, resources exploited, and economies expanded. In a sense, the dream worked exactly as intended. It inspired action, harnessed energy, and structured societal ambition. Its function as a tool did not diminish its impact. It merely revealed that the promise was often instrumental, not intrinsic. Stories of rule followers who failed, of miners who worked without reward, of families who sacrificed everything, illustrate the tension between aspiration and reality. The dream created hope, but did not guarantee fulfillment. It shaped society, even as it obscured inequity. Those who understood this dual nature adapted, finding ways to leverage the dream strategically, while those who took it as truth often faced disappointment and disillusionment. As decades passed, patterns emerged. Entrepreneurs exploited labor by promising opportunity. Politicians motivated migration with visions of prosperity. Religious and educational institutions reinforced obedience. The dream became embedded in narratives of national identity, perpetuating itself as a tool, even as it was treated as a universal truth. The pattern was clear. The dream served the goals of those wielding it, often at the expense of those chasing it. Yet the human response to the dream was not passive. Communities found ways to reinterpret, resist, or repurpose it. Immigrants formed support networks, laborers organized unions, women established cooperative schools and mutual aid societies. The dream's promise could inspire cooperation, adaptation, and resilience, even when it failed as a guarantee. Its tool-like nature was evident, but it could also be harnessed creatively, empowering those who recognized its mechanics. In reflection, the dream's duality is unavoidable. It is simultaneously motivating and manipulative, inspiring and coercive, hopeful and deceptive. Those who took it as absolute truth were vulnerable. Those who recognized it as a tool could navigate its power. Understanding the dream as a mechanism rather than a guarantee allowed communities to act strategically, protect themselves, and create systems of mutual support. The enduring lesson is that ambition alone does not ensure outcome. The promise of the dream is contingent, shaped by circumstance, power, and social structures. Success requires adaptation, awareness, and cooperation. The dream motivates, but it does not rescue. It guides, but it does not guarantee. To pursue it without understanding its mechanics is to risk disappointment. To recognize it as a tool is to wield it wisely. Ultimately, those who understood this truth created legacies. They built towns, cultivated land, formed networks, and nurtured generations. They learned to follow the dream critically, not blindly, and to distinguish between promise and instrument. The dream inspired them, but they survived because of foresight, strategy, and resilience. They understood that success is never guaranteed, even when ambition is genuine. In the end, the story of the dream as a tool reminds us that cultural narratives are rarely neutral. Aspirations can inspire, but they can also guide behavior toward ends defined by others. The dream's power lies not in its truth, but in its ability to shape action. Recognizing this, those who pursued it thoughtfully transformed themselves, their communities, and their futures, not because the dream was guaranteed, but because they learned to navigate it wisely. Those who survived, thrived, and passed on their legacies did so not because the dream promised wealth or success, but because they understood its role as a tool, one to be harnessed, questioned, and redirected. And in this understanding lies the enduring lesson. The dream is not truth, it is method, mechanism, and motivation, and those who recognize this can wield it without surrendering to its illusions.
For as long as anyone could remember, the promise of America had been whispered across generations. Fathers spoke of opportunity as though it were a tangible object. Mothers imbued their children with dreams of possibility, and letters carried visions of abundance across oceans and mountains. Yet, as time moved forward, a subtle truth revealed itself. The people who inherited these dreams rarely inherited the results. What was passed down was hope itself, a relentless, inspiring, but often unfulfilled inheritance. In the late 1800s, families began traveling westward in droves, fueled by stories of fertile land, gold-laden rivers, and new beginnings. Parents imagined the lives their children could lead, free from debt, full of learning, and rich with opportunity. Children, too young to grasp the full weight of the journey, absorbed the excitement and expectation. Each step west was framed as a step toward fulfillment. Every creek, every hill, every stretch of open prairie was a promise of results, though those results were seldom guaranteed. The trek itself was unforgiving. Families traversed deserts, climbed rugged mountains, and crossed rivers that threatened to wash away both livestock and supplies. Weather alternated between merciless heat and freezing nights. Yet parents persevered, believing their toil would secure a better future for their children. For you, they said, as they hoisted wagons over rocky inclines or coaxed cattle across sand-swept plains. But children, witnessing exhaustion and loss firsthand, learned early that hope was more plentiful than comfort, and promise often exceeded reality. In new settlements, families confronted the first signs of disparity between hope and outcome. Land that had been advertised as fertile could be rocky or prone to flooding. Mines that glimmered with golden possibility were often barren. Crops failed, livestock perished, and illnesses spread unchecked.
Yet families clung to the dream, framing setbacks as lessons rather than failures. Hope became the currency by which families measured success, even when tangible results were elusive. Generations grew up absorbing this worldview. Children learned that life demanded endurance, resilience, and belief, even when the world seemed indifferent. Schools were rudimentary, often requiring children to contribute labor at home or in fields. Books were rare, and education came at the cost of time and energy. Still, parents insisted that knowledge, discipline, and fortitude would one day pay off. One day, they said, the land will yield, the rivers will turn gold, and all of this will be yours to build upon. Yet one day was rarely immediate. Some families waited decades for prosperity that never materialized. The promise of wealth or land ownership could take a lifetime, and even then, it was subject to factors beyond control: droughts, illness, economic collapse, or political shifts. The inheritance of hope became more apparent than the inheritance of property or wealth. The moral and emotional lessons of patience, endurance, and belief were tangible, but material reward remained uncertain. As families endured, they also encountered systemic barriers that shaped outcomes unevenly. Indigenous nations were displaced to make way for settlers, yet the settlers themselves were not guaranteed success. Racism, gendered expectations, and legal inequities shaped who could claim land, start businesses, or access education. Children absorbed these realities silently, learning early that the promise of opportunity was selective. Hope, however, was universal, and it was what they inherited in abundance. In mining towns, the lesson of hope without results was particularly stark. Families who had traveled across mountains to find gold discovered that the rivers were often barren or already claimed. Fathers and older sons worked tirelessly at pans and sluices, while children fetched water, fed animals, and maintained the camp. Small successes were celebrated disproportionately because they were rare. Even when a nugget was found, the economic impact could be fleeting. Gold was not distributed fairly, and yet the family unit maintained belief in eventual reward.
Farming communities offered a similar picture. Parents worked from dawn to dusk, clearing land, sowing seeds, and tending livestock. Some years produced modest yields. Other years ended in ruin. Children were drafted into labor alongside their parents, learning both the rhythms of survival and the fragile nature of expectation. They were told that toil and virtue would eventually secure a better life. Yet many grew up to find that land ownership, profitable harvests, or independence were as uncertain as the weather. What they inherited from their parents was faith, endurance, and the ability to hope. The social and cultural impact of this inheritance shaped entire communities. Churches, town gatherings, and informal mentoring networks reinforced the idea that hope was a guiding force. Stories of pioneers who succeeded, even if rare, served as moral exemplars. Community festivals celebrated hard work, courage, and vision, often masking the fact that true prosperity was scarce. Children absorbed both the inspiration and the reality, learning that life could demand immense effort without guaranteeing proportionate reward. Generational patterns became cyclical. Children who inherited hope often internalized the same belief systems and behaviors as their parents. They took risks, traveled long distances, invested time and labor, and endured hardship, all guided by the notion that patience, morality, and perseverance would eventually yield success. And yet the results often remained limited, contingent, or delayed beyond immediate recognition. The inheritance of hope became a defining trait, influencing the character and worldview of multiple generations. Hope itself became a survival mechanism. It allowed families to endure famine, disease, and economic uncertainty. It enabled children to develop resilience, creativity, and adaptability.
Communities formed around shared belief in eventual reward, reinforcing bonds even in the absence of material success. Hope became a cultural artifact, passed along as carefully and intentionally as land or tools, teaching that even when results were scarce, endurance and belief were not wasted. The lessons extended beyond survival. Those who inherited hope without immediate results developed strategies for navigating uncertainty. They learned to diversify labor, save where possible, and invest in knowledge, relationships, and social networks. Risk-taking was tempered by observation and adaptation. Hope became both motivation and calibration, guiding decisions even when the environment offered no guarantees. In urban centers, the pattern persisted. Immigrant families arriving in new cities brought stories of opportunity and prosperity, yet they found housing scarcity, exploitative labor, and systemic barriers. Children were educated in crowded schools, worked in factories, and contributed to household income from a young age. Material reward was inconsistent, yet hope persisted. It was reinforced in homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods, creating cultural continuity across generations. The psychological inheritance of hope also had costs. Children carried the weight of expectation, internalizing both the stories of potential success and the burdens of labor and sacrifice. They learned early to cope with disappointment, delay gratification, and measure progress not in immediate results, but in incremental improvement. Resilience became an inherited trait, cultivated alongside hope itself. Yet hope was not blind. Communities developed rituals, traditions, and narratives to interpret setbacks. Festivals, storytelling, and shared reflection served to reinforce belief, provide emotional cohesion, and frame failure as a step along a journey rather than a permanent deficit. In doing so, the inheritance of hope was coupled with cultural tools to sustain it, even in the absence of tangible outcomes. By the 20th century, these patterns had evolved, but the core lesson remained. Families inherited hope more reliably than results. Economic booms and technological change created opportunities for some, but systemic inequities and chance ensured that not all benefited equally. The cultural transmission of belief in possibility persisted even when practical fulfillment lagged behind. Generations internalized that effort, morality, and perseverance were virtues independent of outcome. The story of hope without guaranteed results illuminates the complexity of the human experience. It shows that what is passed down is not only material wealth or property, but also resilience, imagination, and vision. Children inherited moral frameworks, ethical standards, and strategies for survival that enabled them to navigate environments often indifferent or hostile. The inheritance of hope shaped character, community, and culture, even when material success remained elusive. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Societies, families, and cultures transmit not only achievements, but also expectations, beliefs, and tools for survival. Inheriting hope without immediate results is not failure. It is the cultivation of capacity, patience, and vision. The promise of opportunity may remain unfulfilled in material terms, but the ability to persevere, imagine, and strive constitutes its own enduring legacy. The children of pioneers, immigrants, and laborers carried forward hope as a guiding principle. It shaped their decisions, ambitions, and relationships. Even when the tangible results of past efforts were scarce, hope provided direction and purpose. Communities endured, adapted, and thrived in unexpected ways. The inheritance of hope became a foundation for future generations to navigate a world where certainty was rare, but possibility remained. In the end, the American story is inseparable from this paradox. Nations, families, and individuals inherit visions of greatness, freedom, and opportunity that may never be fully realized. Yet these inheritances shape identity, values, and action. Hope, even in the absence of results, ensures that each generation approaches life with courage, imagination, and determination. It is both a tool and a treasure, a legacy of resilience passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, across time. Generations learned that the dream's fulfillment was uncertain, but its pursuit was meaningful. Hope became a compass, guiding decisions, inspiring labor, and shaping culture. It was an inheritance not of certainty, but of possibility. And in this truth lies both challenge and beauty, that families may inherit dreams whose results are uncertain, yet the persistence of hope itself guarantees that the spirit of striving endures.
For decades, the promise of the American dream had been a guiding star. Across the vast plains, through crowded cities, and over the misty ports where immigrants arrived with hope in their eyes, the narrative was clear. Opportunity awaited anyone willing to work, endure, and believe. It was a dream of land, of independence, of wealth, of reinvention. Yet there came a moment, subtle at first, when people began to see that the dream might not belong to everyone equally, and that the cost of its pursuit was often paid in blood, sweat, and erasure. It began in small ways. Families who had invested years in farms found soil too thin, crops destroyed by floods or drought. Miners who risked everything discovered rivers already claimed, and when gold appeared, it often slipped through their fingers. Immigrant laborers who had crossed oceans and endured months of peril were told that opportunity existed for them, but only in the shadow of others. Slowly, quietly, questions arose. Was the dream real, or had it been a story crafted to compel hope and obedience? In urban neighborhoods, these doubts were first visible in children's eyes. Immigrant families crowded into tenements, and children watched parents labor in factories, construction sites, and laundries for meager pay. Every evening, families returned home exhausted, their hands raw, their hopes pinned on the chance that education, skill, or luck would yield change. Yet the pattern persisted: work without reward, perseverance without guarantee. For the first time, young men and women began to ask aloud whether the promise of opportunity was universal or whether it had always been reserved for a select few. On the plains and in the hills, the questioning took another form. Settlers and farmers had spent decades carving out land, erecting homes, and clearing fields, believing that property and labor would secure a legacy for their children. Yet surveys, taxes, and the arrival of wealthier speculators often displaced families who had been present for generations. Children who grew up seeing toil equated with entitlement began to understand that the rules were uneven, the dream conditional. They began to challenge the narrative quietly, observing that effort alone did not guarantee reward. Mining towns were crucibles of awakening. In the gold fields, men and women arrived believing in the fairness of chance. A pan in the river or a shovel in the hillside could yield wealth. They worked from dawn to dusk, often in dangerous conditions, and witnessed fortune favoring those already equipped with capital, connections, or insider knowledge. Disappointment was commonplace, yet it was often blamed on individual skill rather than systemic inequality. Still, as stories circulated and letters returned home, it became harder to ignore the reality. The dream was selective, and sometimes cruelly so. Labor movements provided fertile ground for the questioning of the dream. Factory workers, railroad laborers, and miners began to organize, noting that their sacrifices generated wealth for owners while leaving them with minimal security. Meetings were held in crowded halls, under flickering lamps, and sometimes outdoors beneath the stars. Discussions centered on fairness, access, and justice. The dream, they realized, was not a neutral guarantee. It was a tool wielded by some to extract labor from others. For the first time, the idea that the dream itself might be a construct of power rather than a natural law took root.
Racial inequities intensified the questioning. Black families, both freed and freeborn, understood early that freedom alone did not yield equality. Segregated schools, restricted voting rights, and limited access to employment opportunities revealed that the dream was bounded by invisible walls. Similarly, indigenous communities saw lands taken and promises broken, noting that legal systems often reinforced displacement rather than preventing it. Chinese immigrants, Mexican laborers, and other marginalized groups experienced exclusion as a rule rather than an exception. Each injustice chipped away at the myth that hard work and belief could overcome all obstacles. The cultural landscape amplified these revelations. Newspapers, initially filled with celebratory narratives of progress and opportunity, began printing stories of strikes, eviction, and displacement. Pamphlets circulated in communities highlighting systemic abuses and offering critiques of labor practices, immigration restrictions, and the exploitation of natural resources. Writers and thinkers began to challenge the universal validity of the dream, arguing that it had always been conditional, selective, and shaped to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Among families, these realizations were deeply personal. Parents who had devoted lifetimes to labor discovered that their children might inherit little more than struggle. Children, in turn, questioned the wisdom of sacrifices that demanded obedience, submission, and endurance without promise of material security. Conversations shifted from blind hope to critical reflection. Letters from distant relatives, once filled with exhortations to pursue opportunity, now carried warnings, frustrations, and questions about fairness. The narrative of absolute possibility was being replaced by a nuanced understanding of conditional reality. Education played a role in catalyzing this shift. Schools, though limited in resources, introduced children to history, science, and social studies that highlighted inequalities, past injustices, and the ways in which societies distribute opportunity. Teachers, some sympathetic, others constrained by local norms, encouraged discussion about labor, property, and justice. As knowledge spread, so did awareness. The dream was not a universal guarantee. It was a story that required critique, analysis, and understanding. Political movements of the era also reflected the growing disillusionment. Populist and labor parties gained traction, advocating for land reform, fair wages, and equitable distribution of resources. Campaigns emphasized that opportunity must be systemic, not merely aspirational. People demanded policies that addressed structural barriers, recognizing that personal effort alone could not compensate for systemic inequities. The questioning of the dream moved from individual reflection to collective action. Economic depressions and natural disasters accelerated skepticism. Crops failed, banks collapsed, and entire communities suffered. People who had invested everything in the promise of stability found themselves destitute, while others who benefited from social or economic connections weathered the crises with relative ease. Observers began to see patterns, recognizing that the dream's rewards were contingent on circumstances often beyond individual control. Hope persisted, but confidence in fairness waned. Religious and philosophical thought provided frameworks to interpret this emerging reality. Sermons and lectures began to distinguish between spiritual virtue and material reward, emphasizing that perseverance, morality, and community cohesion were values independent of wealth. Intellectuals debated whether the dream should be pursued at all, or whether a new framework of social justice and shared opportunity was necessary. These conversations, though contentious, reinforced that questioning the dream was both rational and necessary. In cities and towns, grassroots activism grew.
Women organized mutual aid societies, children's education programs, and cooperative markets. Immigrant groups founded associations to protect labor rights, provide legal counsel, and document injustices. These acts of collective organization were born from a recognition that the dream could not be accessed individually by all. Structural support was required to ensure opportunity was not restricted to the privileged few. Stories began to circulate that highlighted the human cost of unquestioned belief in the dream. Families who had migrated for opportunity faced illness, starvation, or eviction. Laborers who built infrastructure found themselves without compensation. Children grew up knowing work and struggle intimately, yet few inherited prosperity. The contrast between hope and outcome was stark, and these narratives became foundational to a growing critique of the American ideal. By the turn of the century, the moment of questioning was widely recognized. People who had once accepted the dream uncritically now saw its edges, exclusions, and contradictions. They understood that opportunity was mediated by race, class, geography, and circumstance. Yet, even as skepticism grew, hope endured. It was no longer naive, it was informed, critical, and tempered by experience. Families passed down not only aspiration, but also the wisdom to question, evaluate, and resist inequities. The legacy of this questioning extended across generations. Children who grew up observing inequity and structural bias developed resilience and advocacy. Communities learned to organize, document injustice, and protect vulnerable members. The dream was no longer a simple story. It was a landscape of possibility tempered by knowledge. It was a tool for ambition, but now also a subject of scrutiny and moral reflection. In retrospect, the moment people began to question the dream marked a turning point in American consciousness. It revealed the limits of faith in systemic fairness and highlighted the necessity of critical thinking, collective action, and vigilance. Hope remained, but it was no longer blind. It was informed, adaptive, and reflective. Those who lived through this realization carried lessons forward, ensuring that the promise of the dream could be evaluated, contested, and pursued with eyes wide open. To live in the wake of this realization was both sobering and liberating. Hope could still inspire, but it was paired with understanding. Effort remained valuable, but it was no longer naively equated with guaranteed reward. Communities learned to value solidarity, advocacy, and shared knowledge alongside individual ambition. The dream, once unquestioned, became a narrative to engage with critically, a challenge to understand, and a guide to navigate a world where fairness was neither automatic nor universal. The moment people began to question the dream was not the end of hope, it was the maturation of it. It was the recognition that aspiration without reflection was fragile, that opportunity without critique was exploitative, and that the pursuit of a better life required both faith and discernment. Those who lived through this realization carried lessons forward, ensuring that the promise of the dream could be evaluated, contested, and pursued with eyes wide open.
For generations, people carried dreams as if they were tangible objects, carefully preserved and passed from parent to child. Dreams of a better life, of opportunity, of wealth and freedom, often traveled farther than the bodies that bore them. Across continents and oceans, men, women, and children pursued the promise of the new world, convinced that effort, courage, and faith would transform aspiration into reality. Yet dreams, once thought unassailable, sometimes fracture. They are fragile under the weight of expectation, circumstance, and inequality. And when they break, people must discover what replaces them, what fills the void left behind, and how hope can survive the truth. It begins with arrival.
Immigrants from distant shores stepped onto harbors with nothing more than a dream and a single suitcase, scanning the unfamiliar streets for the signs of possibility they had been promised. Farmers from Europe arrived in plains where the soil was harsher than maps had suggested. Families escaping oppression in their homelands discovered new forms of inequality awaiting them. For some, the first taste of disillusionment came in the shape of impossibly high rents, unstable work, or the realization that the neighbors, language, and systems were not constructed for their success. The dream often arrived first in stories, letters, and pamphlets. Accounts of fortunes made overnight, towns built from nothing, and fields yielding bountiful crops created a narrative almost impossible to resist. Yet these stories rarely mention the years of toil, the disease, the failed harvests, and the families that vanished from hardship. Those who lived the reality discovered the first truth about dreams. They are selective in their generosity, offering plenty to some while withholding almost everything from others. In the mines, the collapse of the dream was immediate for many. Men and women arrived expecting gold to flow in panfuls, believing that their labor alone would determine fortune. Instead, they faced exhaustion, disappointment, and inequality. Those who struck a nugget often found themselves at the mercy of local power structures. Claim disputes, unscrupulous merchants, and violence frequently determined who profited and who remained destitute. Over time, the once shimmering dream revealed its darker face. It was a story designed to motivate, not a guarantee of success. Families experienced the dream's fracture differently. Fathers who had left homes for distant towns returned to find children grown without guidance. Mothers who had sacrificed everything to follow opportunity discovered that labor alone could not secure security. Letters from abroad, once filled with encouragement, returned as silence or disappointment. The illusion of the dream demanded faith in its promises, yet provided no instruction for coping when faith faltered. Families had to adapt, replacing expectation with endurance, hope with strategy, and dreams with pragmatic survival. Communities evolved around shared disillusionment. Neighborhoods of immigrants, workers, and displaced farmers became spaces where reality tempered expectation. Residents learned that solidarity replaced the individualistic pursuit of fortune. Mutual aid societies, communal kitchens, and cooperative labor systems emerged, teaching that survival often required collaboration rather than blind ambition. The collapse of the dream, while painful, created the conditions for collective resilience, even if recognition of that resilience would not arrive for decades.
In urban centers, the illusion's collapse revealed the machinery of inequity. Factories and construction sites promised employment, yet paid meager wages and enforced grueling schedules. Wealth accumulated in offices and boardrooms, far from the streets where laborers toiled. The dream, in this context, was a tool to maintain compliance. It compelled effort while masking systemic exploitation. Awareness of this dynamic did not come all at once. It grew over time as workers began to see patterns, share experiences, and recognize that their effort alone would rarely produce the outcomes they had been promised. Education became both a refuge and a revelation. Children whose parents had pursued opportunity discovered that schools offered not only knowledge, but insight into the forces shaping their lives. They learned that the promise of mobility was not evenly distributed, and that systems of law, finance, and property often favored those already privileged. They studied histories that celebrated triumph but omitted struggle, discovering the gaps between story and reality. Knowledge replaced naivety. Critical thinking began to substitute for unquestioning faith. The disillusionment of the dream also brought new forms of creativity. Artists, writers, and thinkers began to document lives outside the official narrative, capturing the tension between hope and reality.
Murals in city halls, essays in underground newspapers, and songs sung in workhouses expressed the emotional landscape left in the wake of broken promises. These cultural products provided what the dream could not: recognition, validation, and the articulation of a reality often silenced. Where wealth and success had been expected, understanding and empathy began to emerge. Labor movements amplified this new consciousness. Strikes, petitions, and collective negotiations revealed the extent to which the dream had been wielded as a motivator rather than a guarantee. Workers demanded fair compensation, better conditions, and protections against exploitation. The collapse of faith in the individualistic promise of the dream shifted focus to systemic change. If opportunity was not inherent, it must be fought for, negotiated, and defended. The broken illusion inspired activism that would ripple across generations. Even in rural regions, where independence had once been romanticized, the failure of the dream became evident. Farmers who had believed that land ownership equated to prosperity found themselves trapped in cycles of debt and environmental instability. Natural disasters, market fluctuations, and political favoritism often determined outcomes more than labor or skill. Communities began to adapt, creating networks of shared resources, knowledge exchange, and collective planning. In these adaptations, a new kind of hope emerged, one that acknowledged reality while striving to improve it. The breaking of the dream forced personal reflection. Individuals realized that ambition alone could not secure stability or success. Some redirected energy from pursuit of material gain toward community engagement, creative expression, or family cohesion. Others became advocates, educators, or organizers, channeling disappointment into societal impact. The void left by the dream's collapse was filled with purpose, not wealth, a purpose that acknowledged limits while seeking meaningful outcomes. Migration itself became a lesson in adaptation. Those who had crossed oceans or borders in search of opportunity discovered that new lands did not inherently yield prosperity. Some returned home, wiser and more cautious. Others stayed, building alternative paths to security. Cities and towns became laboratories for pragmatic adaptation, where people discovered that social networks, cooperation, and knowledge could compensate for the unpredictability of fortune. The dream's collapse, paradoxically, catalyzed practical innovation. Disillusionment also revealed the fragility of inherited expectations. Parents who had promised prosperity through work and perseverance confronted the limits of what they could provide. Children learned that aspiration must be tempered by understanding of constraints, that labor does not always translate into reward. These lessons, hard-earned and often unwelcome, shaped a generation that balanced ambition with realism. The collapse of the dream replaced certainty with judgment and naivety with critical foresight. Economic cycles reinforced these lessons. Depressions, market crashes, and industrial shifts revealed that systems prioritized profit over individual effort. Laborers discovered that fortune could vanish despite perfect adherence to rules. Communities developed coping mechanisms, from cooperative farming to labor unions, mitigating the impact of systemic inequities. Practical adaptation replaced blind hope as the dominant strategy for survival and progress. The social contract itself began to be interrogated. Questions arose: who decides which opportunities are real? Who benefits when promises fail? Which structures enforce inequality? Activists, educators, and writers challenged assumptions, demonstrating that dreams are not neutral. They reflect power, policy, and precedent. Communities began to realize that if hope was to survive, it required organization, advocacy, and the courage to demand fairness. Spiritual and philosophical reflections offered solace. Religious leaders, philosophers, and teachers emphasized that human dignity, creativity, and morality endure independent of material success. Values once subordinated to wealth and achievement were reconsidered.
Community, resilience, and knowledge became measures of meaningful existence. Even as the dream faltered, a richer sense of purpose and ethics emerged, creating frameworks for life beyond broken illusions. By the end of the century, the landscape of hope had transformed. Dreams, once naive and absolute, were now tempered by awareness. Individuals and communities pursued opportunity, but with caution, strategy, and an understanding of systemic inequities. The void left by failed promises was filled with connection, knowledge, and the pursuit of justice. The collapse of the dream revealed that aspiration alone is insufficient. Action, insight, and solidarity are required to replace it. Ultimately, what replaces a dream when the illusion breaks is neither despair nor resignation. It is the recognition that hope must coexist with realism, that opportunity must be understood as conditional, and that fulfillment may emerge in unexpected ways. Communities, families, and individuals discovered that resilience, collaboration, and purpose could sustain life even when the initial promise failed. The dream's collapse, painful though it was, paved the way for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of aspiration. The lessons endured across generations. Children born into uncertainty learned the value of strategy and foresight. Communities built mutual support systems. Activists and educators created channels to advocate for fairness and justice. The illusion had broken, but what replaced it was a richer, more grounded hope, a hope informed by experience, strengthened by connection, and guided by awareness. In the end, people learned that the dream is not an entitlement. It is a story, a tool, and a challenge. When the illusion breaks, the vacuum it leaves is not emptiness, but opportunity for understanding. It is filled with wisdom, resilience, and deliberate action. People discovered that real fulfillment does not always arrive in the shape promised, but can emerge from adaptation, solidarity, and insight. The broken dream is not a failure. It is the moment when humanity learns to define hope on its own terms.